Settle in. Let your eyes grow heavy and your breath slow. Tonight, you'll journey into a mystery unlike any other, not loud or hurried, but quiet, deliberate, and deeply human. A mystery whispered through chalk lines on an old garden door. This is the story of Hilton Cubitt, a kind-hearted man from the English countryside, his gentle American wife, Elsie, and the strange, childlike figures that began to appear around their manor. Stick men dancing in silence. What began as innocent drawings soon became messages, then warnings, then something far more dangerous. In this calm, atmospheric tale of cryptic codes and concealed pasts, you'll follow Sherlock Holmes through peaceful gardens, quiet hallways, and the slow unraveling of a message that nearly went unanswered. So close your eyes. Let the quiet tension of Riddling Thorpe Manor draw you in. This is not a story of horror, but of hidden truths, deep love, and the courage it takes to finally speak. Welcome to the adventure of the dancing men. The morning air on Baker Street had that pale blue stillness that only a late spring day in London could bring. It was the kind of morning when time felt slower, as if the city itself was exhaling. In the flat at 2 Rue 1B, the quiet was nearly complete, broken only by the distant creak of a carriage wheel below and the soft clink of porcelain as Dr. Watson gently set his teacup onto the saucer. The fire was kept low, more for comfort than necessity, its glow brushing gently against the walls with a lazy warmth. Sherlock Holmes sat in his usual armchair, half-shadowed, his legs crossed neatly, and his fingertips pressed together. His gaze was fixed on the ceiling, though his mind was undoubtedly far beyond it. Across from him, Watson flipped through the morning newspaper without much attention, pausing occasionally to glance at Holmes, who had said almost nothing since breakfast. The room itself was quiet, lined with well-worn books, an assortment of scientific instruments, a violin resting in the corner, and the faint smell of tobacco still hanging in the air from the evening before. Everything spoke of routine, of known comforts and familiar silences. Then came the sound, footsteps, slow but firm, rising up the stairs, not the hesitant tread of a lost visitor or the confident stride of an officer. It was something else, steady, measured, with a kind of deliberate weight behind it. Holmes lowered his hand slowly and spoke, without looking at Watson. A visitor from the countryside, Norfolk, if I'm not mistaken, likely a landowner, or someone accustomed to open fields rather than city streets. Watson gave him a sideways glance, mildly amused, though no longer surprised by Holmes's deductions. A moment later, there was a knock at the door. 3 clear raps. Not aggressive, but not uncertain either. Watson rose to answer it, opening the door to reveal a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 40s, perhaps a little younger, with sun-darkened skin and strong features. His jacket was tidy, though clearly tailored for practical use rather than fashion. In his hands he held his hat, turning it slowly without seeming to notice. His eyes gave him away, clear blue, but clouded with worry. Not panic, not yet, but something close to it. "Good morning, sir. You must be Mr. Holmes. I hope you'll excuse me for arriving without notice." Holmes motioned calmly to the seat near the hearth. "Please take a moment. You are among friends here." The man stepped into the room, crossing the threshold like someone unsure whether he truly belonged in such a place. Yet there was nothing rude or hesitant in his manner, only a quiet urgency, like a man carrying something heavier than he could explain. Watson observed him closely. The visitor sat with the posture of someone not used to feeling out of place, which made his discomfort all the more visible. His fingers were strong, used to outdoor work, yet they trembled slightly as he settled his hat into his lap. "My name is Hilton Cubitt. I come from Ridlingthorpe Manor in Norfolk. I hope you won't think me foolish for bringing this to you." But I didn't know where else to turn. Holmes nodded once, encouraging the man to continue without pressure. "It's not the kind of thing I ever imagined myself getting caught up in. I'm just a country gentleman, Mr. Holmes. I've lived my whole life on that estate. Nothing dramatic, nothing strange, until now." He paused, glancing around the room, then looked down at his hands. His voice dropped slightly, as though the next part was difficult to say. "I was married a little over a year ago. Her name is Elsie. She's from America, Chicago to be exact. We met when I was traveling there, taking some time abroad. She's everything I could have hoped for, intelligent, reserved, elegant in her way. But there was one thing, one condition she made clear before we married. She asked that I never ask about her past." Holmes remained perfectly still, and Watson leaned slightly forward in his chair. "I agreed," Hilton said. "Not because I didn't wonder, but because I respected her. She told me there were things she had left behind in America, things she didn't want to relive, and I took her at her word. She's been a good wife, kind and loyal. But lately—" He hesitated again, and for the first time his voice cracked just slightly. "She's changed. There's fear in her now. I see it in the way she carries herself, in her eyes. She's quieter. Sometimes I find her staring out the window for hours, like she's listening for something I can't hear." And then the drawings started. "Drawings?" Holmes asked, his tone calm, almost gentle. Hilton nodded, reaching into the inside pocket of his coat. He pulled out a small folded paper and handed it over carefully, as if it were fragile. "The first one appeared about 2 months ago. It was scrawled in chalk on the door of our garden shed. A series of little figures, stickmen, but drawn in strange poses, like they were dancing. I thought it was a prank at first, maybe village boys being silly. But then another came, this time on paper, slipped under our door. And then another. Each time, different patterns, same little dancing men." Holmes unfolded the paper slowly, examining the figures under the soft light of the sitting room. Each one was a rough drawing of a stick figure, arms in different positions, occasionally a leg bent oddly. There was an eerie rhythm to them, chaotic yet purposeful. "They've come 6 times now," Hilton continued. "No note, no explanation. But every time my wife sees one, she goes pale. Sometimes she starts crying. Sometimes she locks herself in our bedroom and won't speak to me for hours. I've asked her what they mean, begged her to tell me, but all she says is that it's nothing, that it's better if I don't know." Watson sat back, exhaling quietly. Holmes remained silent for a long moment, his eyes tracing the patterns of the dancing figures. "Mr. Cubitt," he said eventually, "these are not meaningless, not to someone who understands them." "I thought perhaps it was some kind of code," Hilton replied. "I'm not a learned man in that way, but I'm not blind. They follow a pattern. They're meant for someone, and I fear they're meant for her." "You did the right thing by coming here," Holmes said. "I want you to send me every new drawing the moment you find it, no matter the hour. Do not wait." Hilton looked visibly relieved, though the shadows beneath his eyes did not fade. "You believe this could be serious? I believe it already is." The silence returned for a moment, filled only by the low, steady pop of the fire. Outside, a soft wind stirred through the chimney, a reminder that somewhere beyond the streets of London, a larger story had already begun to move. Holmes folded the paper gently and set it on the table. "You may rest now, Mr. Cubitt. You've done what you can for today, and I assure you, you have my full attention." And so the first piece of the mystery was placed quietly onto the board. a country gentleman, a secret past, and the quiet terror of little dancing men drawn in silence but screaming to be understood. Understood and fully committed. From this moment forward, every part of the story will be developed with maximum narrative care, deep detail, and structural precision, always within the tone and spirit of Arthur Conan Doyle's detective fiction, while maintaining a soothing, immersive flow suitable for adult bedtime listening. There will be no repetitions of prior parts, and each section will evolve naturally, always building upon the established narrative with consistency, mystery, and literary refinement. I will now proceed with the carefully crafted and extended Part 2, The Mystery of the Drawings. The soft rain that had begun sometime around midday now tapped lightly against the windows of 221B Baker Street, a gentle percussion that added to the steady hush of the flat. London's skyline had faded into a dull haze, the buildings across the street reduced to ghostly outlines in the mist. The oil lamps inside gave the room a golden warmth that stood in pleasing contrast to the chill beyond the glass. Holmes sat in his usual place, elbows balanced on the arms of the chair, fingertips meeting in still contemplation. The piece of paper bearing the strange stick figures lay flat on the table before him, smoothed out and weighed down gently at the corners by a pocket knife and a silver matchbox. Dr. Watson had long since set down his newspaper and had taken to watching Holmes with the quiet patience of a man accustomed to the rhythm of genius. He knew better than to speak while Holmes was in the middle of his mental sifting, as though each thought passed through a mesh, discarding the irrelevant, isolating the meaningful, sharpening the focus like the lens of a telescope drawing a distant star into view. Holmes had not moved for several minutes. His gaze, steady and narrowed, remained fixed on the sequence of dancing men, absorbing not merely the image, but the intention behind it. Each figure, crudely rendered in black ink, stood alone, yet seemed to gesture toward the next, as if there were a hidden current running through them, something silent but structured. Watson finally broke the silence, though softly. "There is something almost childish about them, is there not?" Holmes did not look away. Childish, perhaps, in style, but not in purpose. These marks are calculated. Observe their positioning. No two are identical, yet certain figures repeat with variations in arm placement. The consistency of scale suggests a deliberate system. This is no doodle. He leaned slightly forward, drawing the sheet closer, then reached for a clean page and began to copy the figures slowly, with precise strokes, labeling each one in a quiet system of his own devising. Watson rose and poured a second cup of tea, moving about the room with deliberate quietness. He had seen Holmes in this state before, what he had once described in his journals as a kind of focused trance. The signs were always the same: the slight narrowing of the eyes, the sudden refusal to acknowledge any surrounding distraction, the faint tapping of a finger when an idea began to form. Holmes spoke again, this time more to himself than to Watson. "They are symbols, not words, but letters, perhaps. A substitution cipher. It mimics language. It has rhythm. These figures are not simply art. They are speech in disguise." He rose, walked to his desk, and opened the middle drawer with purpose, retrieving a slender volume which he laid open on the table. It was a reference guide on ciphers, something he had consulted in past cases, especially those involving foreign scripts or espionage-related correspondence. But this was different, more intimate, more urgent. Holmes turned back to the drawing and pointed to one of the repeated figures. "This one appears more frequently than the others. If we assume it represents a common letter, perhaps E, which is the most frequent letter in the English alphabet, it may give us a foothold." Watson had moved to stand beside him, peering down at the markings. To the untrained eye, the little stickmen seemed almost comical, dancing in place with uplifted limbs. But the sequence of them held a structure that became clearer the longer one observed them. Like notes in an unfamiliar musical scale, their meanings hidden in repetition and variation. The implication troubled Watson more than he admitted. "So someone is sending her messages," he said quietly. "Coded ones, and she understands them." Holmes did not look up. Indeed, she not only understands them, she fears them, which suggests that the sender is no stranger to her. The message is private, personal, and most importantly, unwelcome. He placed his hand flat against the table, as though feeling the weight of the idea settle beneath his palm. "This is not merely a puzzle, Watson. This is a threat, a veiled warning dressed in whimsy, and it is reaching a woman who has spent over a year trying to leave something behind." Holmes paused, then picked up his pencil again. "Observe the spacing between the groups. This is likely sentence structure. This, I believe, is a single word. 4 symbols. And this longer one may be a name, a signature perhaps. We are not yet in the realm of certainty, but the pattern is forming." Watson, ever the practical observer, considered the implications with growing concern. And if this is a signature, it means the sender wants her to know exactly who is behind it. "Precisely," said Holmes. He reached for a second sheet of paper, then paused, his eyes distant for a moment. "The timing of these messages is also significant. They do not appear at random. They are placed carefully, likely during hours when the household is less alert. That suggests familiarity with the manor grounds. The intruder is not simply passing through, he is watching." Watson sat down slowly. "That makes him dangerous and determined." Holmes nodded. "And that, my dear Watson, is precisely why Mr. Cubitt's case demands urgency. We are not dealing with abstract puzzles or anonymous pranks. We are facing an invisible hand reaching across the ocean, tapping on the window pane of a woman who has not yet told her husband the truth." Holmes leaned back and exhaled slowly. "There is more to this than code and fear. There is history buried in that house, and someone is digging it up, one figure at a time." Outside, the rain softened, fading into a misty drizzle. The lamps on the street flickered faintly in the growing dusk. In the warm calm of the room, the dancing men remained on the table, quiet and still, like characters frozen in a moment just before speech. Holmes folded his hands again and closed his eyes briefly. Let the next message arrive. With one more piece of this strange language, the silence will break, and when it does, I intend to be listening. The rain had passed by the following morning, leaving behind a thin film of damp on the streets and rooftops of London. The city stirred with a quiet dignity, as if washing away the night's mysteries in preparation for a new day. At 221B Baker Street, Holmes and Watson sat once more across from their visitor, Hilton Cubitt, who had returned early, as promised, with more papers in hand and a weariness that now clung to him like a second coat. His face bore the signs of a man who had slept little, though his posture remained upright and dignified. There was something unshakably decent about Hilton Cubitt. His presence evoked the kind of confidence one associated with honest landowners, men who knew the land and the rhythm of the seasons, whose handshake still meant something. Yet beneath the surface, the strain had grown sharper. The quiet anxiety from the day before had settled into something heavier. Holmes welcomed him back with the same composed tone, offering a seat and motioning to the fire, which had been stoked against the early chill. Watson poured a fresh cup of tea without being asked, setting it gently before the man, who gave a grateful nod. Before we proceed with the symbols, Holmes said, I believe it would be of great help to understand more fully who you are, Mr. Cubitt. Not merely your present circumstances, but the man behind the name, the home, the life you've built. Cubitt took a moment, warming his hands against the tea, then leaned forward in his chair. There isn't much to tell, he began modestly. I was born and raised in Norfolk, the only son of a family that's farmed the land for generations. Ridlingthorpe Manor is not a grand estate by the standards of some, but it's ours, and it's sound. About 300 acres of mixed use. We've always been what you might call steady people. We don't leave. We don't chase after cities. I suppose I was the first to wander. He paused, reflecting quietly. My father passed on the property to me when I was just over 30. He had grown tired, and I was ready. It was a peaceful time. The people in the village know us. We employ half of them during harvest season. I'm no nobleman, but I've always paid fair wages and done my part. I never saw myself anywhere else. Until you went to America, Watson observed, prompting him gently. Yes, that's right. It was just after the estate had been settled into my name. I had never seen the world. I had heard stories, you see, and I thought, well, what harm could a little travel do? I was curious, and truth be told, I was lonely. I had lost both my parents by then, and I had no siblings. The manor can be quiet, sometimes too quiet. I thought I'd go west, New York, Chicago, maybe even San Francisco. Holmes's gaze sharpened slightly at the name. And Chicago is where you met your wife? It is, Cubitt confirmed, at a gathering held by mutual acquaintances. She was there with a family she boarded with. She caught my attention, not by what she said, but by what she didn't. She was quiet, but not shy. There was a sort of gravity about her. She wasn't like the others. There was no pretense, no performance, just calm, thoughtful silence. Holmes said nothing, but Watson could sense his mind absorbing every word, noting not just the facts, but the emotions layered beneath them. She told me, quite early, that she had endured a difficult life, that there were things behind her that she preferred to leave there. She didn't dramatize it. She simply said that the past was past. I asked her no questions. It was not in my nature to press someone who clearly carried burdens. I saw no reason to challenge what she had overcome. So you married her without ever knowing the details of her life in America? Yes, I did. Cubitt looked directly at Holmes as he answered, without hesitation. I know how that sounds, but I believed her. I still do. Whatever she endured, it marked her, and she came with me freely. She adjusted to Norfolk life better than anyone expected. The villagers took to her in time. At first, she kept to herself, but she opened up gradually, and we were happy, until recently. Cubitt nodded solemnly. The change came quietly. She began to retreat again. The old fear came back into her eyes. And then the drawings began to appear. I tried to shield her from them, but she always seemed to find them first. Did she recognize the figures? Holmes asked. I believe so. She never admitted it, but her reaction was immediate. She would freeze, then excuse herself. Some days she wouldn't speak again until the next morning. The worst of it was the way she started watching the windows at night, like she expected someone to appear from the shadows. Holmes leaned back, tenting his fingers. The fire crackled softly, casting slow-moving shadows across the room. And how is your relationship now? Cubitt was silent for a moment, his jaw tightening slightly. I still love her, if that's what you mean. But there is a distance now, not because she does not care, but because she's protecting me from something. That much I know. She is afraid for both of us, and whatever it is, It has followed her across the ocean. Holmes stood and walked slowly to the window. The city outside was returning to life. Carriages passing, boots striking the wet stone of the pavement, voices in the fog. Yet none of it touched the atmosphere within the room. "You are a rare man, Mr. Cubitt," Holmes said. "Many would have turned to anger or suspicion, but you remain loyal and measured, even in the face of a growing mystery." Cubitt lowered his gaze, his voice quieter now. "She gave me peace, Mr. Holmes. For a time I felt more whole than I ever had. That is not something a man gives up easily." Holmes nodded once, returning to the table. He tapped the folded drawings gently with one fingertip. "Then I promise you this. I will not give this matter less attention than it deserves. There is something dangerous buried in these symbols, but there is also truth, and I intend to find it." Cubitt stood, a little straighter than before, and offered his hand, which Holmes took firmly. "Send word the moment anything new appears," Holmes said again. "Do not delay. The sooner we gather the full pattern, the sooner this silent enemy will lose its power." As Cubitt made his way down the stairs and back into the London streets, Watson watched from the window, noting how the man's stride still bore the heaviness of uncertainty, but now walked with a flicker of hope as well. Holmes remained at the table studying the symbols once more. But now, the meaning of the drawings had been given a name, a place, a heart. They were not simply puzzles now. They were the echo of a life left behind, clawing its way back toward the present. And somewhere, Holmes thought, the one drawing them was waiting. The clock in the sitting room of 221B Baker Street ticked with quiet precision, a subtle metronome to the unfolding thoughts that filled the space. Outside, a thin fog hung low over the city, diffusing the light and muffling the usual clamor of London's early afternoon bustle. Inside, the mood remained still, sharpened now by what Holmes had begun to suspect, that behind the innocent appearance of those dancing figures lay a story, not of puzzles alone, but of a life haunted by a past unwilling to remain buried. Elsie Cubitt had not yet spoken for herself, and yet her presence was beginning to take shape through her husband's words, her silences, and the ripple effect of her hidden fears. Holmes, seated at his writing desk, thumbed gently through the collected pages of stick-figure symbols, while Watson reviewed a few notes of his own, compiling character sketches, timelines, and early impressions. What they had was not yet enough to solve the case, but it was enough to begin listening to the deeper silences beneath the facts. Holmes broke from his stillness only to reach for his casebook, where he kept records not of current investigations, but of individuals whose names had once surfaced in prior inquiries, especially those whose shadows had reached beyond national borders. Chicago was not unfamiliar to him, nor were the criminal elements that had, in more than one instance, reached even as far as British soil. He tapped the pages once, thoughtful. "Watson, let us consider what we know, and more importantly, what we do not." Mrs. Elsie Cubitt arrived in England with no family name to accompany her, no letters of introduction, no history before her marriage, except the fact that she came from Chicago and wished never to speak of what came before. She did not hide this, yet she left no path open for curiosity. Watson nodded slowly, following Holmes's rhythm. She warned Hilton Cubitt clearly enough. Whatever she left behind, it was not simply unpleasant. It was dangerous. Precisely. And the drawings, Watson, those strange figures, they are a summons, not a curiosity. Someone from her past is speaking to her in a language they both understand. And what we must consider now is what sort of life breeds that kind of shared code. He rose, stepped to the fireplace and stirred the coals gently, watching the embers shift and flare. Women do not flee ordinary misfortunes across an ocean, Holmes continued. They do not reinvent themselves so completely unless the memory they escape is one that endangers them. And I fear that the sender of these drawings, this silent correspondent, is not simply a messenger. He is a pursuer. Watson glanced again at the most recent page of figures. You suspect criminal involvement? At the very least, I suspect Elsie Cubitt was once entangled, willingly or unwillingly, in the world of men whose business is not governed by the law. And if she knows this code, then she must also know its author. The fear she carries is not abstract. It is personal. A few hours later, a quiet knock came at the door downstairs. Mrs. Hudson, ever discreet, showed in a messenger from the telegraph office. The boy, no older than 15, handed Holmes a small envelope. Holmes opened it carefully. Watson leaned closer as he read. A single line from Hilton Cubitt. She received another note this morning. She has locked herself in her room. I beg you to come. Holmes folded the paper slowly. It's time we see the manor for ourselves. By the following evening, Holmes and Watson were aboard the train heading northeast. The countryside rolled past in soft waves of green and gold, the occasional copse of trees standing like silent sentinels. Holmes spent the journey in contemplative quiet, occasionally sketching versions of the dancing men in his notebook, drawing small lines between figures, testing frequencies, matching symbols. But Watson, ever the observer of people as much as facts, spent the time reflecting on Elsie herself. It was not difficult to imagine her in a place like Ridlingthorpe Manor, elegant, reserved, quietly foreign among the hedgerows and cottages of Norfolk. One could almost see her walking the hallways with a distant look in her eyes, like someone grateful for peace but unable to relax fully into it. The kind of woman who smiled at others' jokes without laughing herself, who looked out windows when no one was watching, who kept a letter hidden away that she never intended to send. There was something tragic in her choice of silence. It was not pride, it was protection. She had warned her husband, she had asked not to be questioned, but fear had found her again, and now the life she built was slipping under the pressure of the past returning, not through voice or presence, but through symbols drawn in black ink and left like silent footsteps at the threshold of her new life. Watson turned to Holmes. Do you suppose she still believes she can keep this past from swallowing the present? Holmes did not look up from his notes. She may hope so, but hope and belief are rarely the same, and I suspect that she is beginning to understand what we already suspect, that whatever she fled from America, it has come for her. The train continued its rhythm toward Norfolk, each turn of the wheels pulling them deeper into a mystery that was no longer just about symbols or fear. It was about history, unfinished, and a secret that had run out of time to remain hidden. The train pulled into the Norfolk station just before nightfall, the sky over Ridlingthorpe a pale slate blue, brushed with streaks of gold that clung to the last remnants of sunlight. The platform was modest and nearly deserted, save for a single waiting coach drawn by a pair of black horses, their breath misting in the cool evening air. The driver tipped his hat as Holmes and Watson stepped down from the train, luggage in hand. The countryside here was wide and gentle, rolling fields bordered by old trees and the soft undulations of low stone walls. The scent of grass and tilled soil was unmistakable, a quiet contrast to the smoke and grit of London. Holmes breathed in the air deeply as they boarded the carriage, his eyes scanning the horizon, though his mind, as always, was several steps ahead. Ridlingthorpe Manor came into view after a short ride. A stately home, not opulent but well kept, its brick facade weathered by years of wind and rain. Lanterns glowed faintly in the windows, casting warm amber tones across the front lawn, which was neatly trimmed, though Watson noted that a few of the hedges bore signs of recent neglect, as if the household's usual rhythms had begun to falter. Hilton Cubitt met them at the front door, dressed in his shirt sleeves, waistcoat unbuttoned. The man who had sat in their London flat with quiet dignity now looked 10 years older, his expression etched with fatigue. His handshake was firm but distracted, and his eyes flicked repeatedly toward the upper landing behind him. "She's resting now," he said, voice low. "Or at least, she's behind her door. I'm not sure if she's sleeping. She hasn't said a word since this morning." He led them through the front hall, past heavy framed portraits and an oak staircase that curled toward the second floor. The manor was silent in the way only country homes could be, filled with the hush of old wood, soft carpets, and the distant ticking of a grandfather clock. A fire had been set in the sitting room, where Hilton poured them each a glass of dark sherry before drawing a folded piece of paper from the inside of his vest. "This came today. I found it tucked into the frame of the window in the drawing room." Holmes took the page carefully, his fingertips tracing the edges as if trying to absorb more than just the ink. He unfolded it slowly. There they were again, 5 figures in a row, their limbs raised in crooked gestures, the angles slightly different from those they had seen before. Holmes stared at them in silence, then nodded once. "This message carries more detail than the last. The spacing is purposeful. You'll notice this cluster of 3 repeated characters. That may indicate a name or perhaps an instruction. I'll need to compare it with the others, but the structure is growing clearer." Hilton nodded grimly. "That's not the first one to appear on the house itself. The very first was drawn on the garden shed door in chalk. Faint but deliberate. Then one came on paper, slipped under the kitchen door. The next was pinned to the inside of the stable, by the hayloft. Always different times. Always unobserved, and always when your wife would be likely to find them? Yes. She seems to notice them before I do. And her reaction is always the same. She stiffens, says nothing, walks away. The staff have started whispering. I've told them nothing, of course, but the tension in the house is growing." Holmes asked to be taken to each location where a figure had appeared. For the next 2 hours, they moved through the property in the fading light, Hilton guiding them to the garden, the stable, the outbuildings, even the unused path behind the house that led toward the edge of the nearby woods. Holmes knelt to inspect surfaces, studied angles of visibility, even noted the faint scuff marks on a window frame where someone had evidently leaned to slide the message between wood and glass. "The perpetrator is careful," Holmes said, his voice calm but firm. "He does not wish to be seen, but he does wish to be found. Or rather, his messages do. He's circling the house, testing its edges, searching for cracks in her defenses." Watson paused, gazing at the trees beyond the back lawn. "He's watching." "Yes," Holmes replied, "and he's patient, which is what concerns me most." They returned to the house as darkness fully fell, the manor now quiet, but for the subtle creaks of settling wood and the occasional hiss from the fire. Holmes requested the drawings again, all of them, laid side by side. He studied them beneath the warm lamplight of the library, fingers gently tracing the patterns, head tilted slightly, lips moving without sound as he worked through possibilities. "Each message carries slight variations in structure," he murmured, "but none of them are random. There's rhythm here, and emotional tone. This one is more compact, urgency, perhaps. This one spaced wide, intended to intimidate. This latest, he paused. It has a different intention. Watson asked, what kind? Holmes looked up. Desperation. Whoever is sending these has realized that silence from Elsie is not due to ignorance. It is defiance, and that defiance is being challenged. Upstairs, behind a closed door, Elsie Cubitt lay in bed with the curtains drawn. Her hands rested across her stomach, unmoving. The room was still, the only sound the faint wind at the window pane. She stared at the ceiling with eyes wide open, not weeping, not trembling, simply waiting. She had known, of course, that the past would not leave her forever. No matter how distant the land or how gentle the love she had found in her husband, there were things that could not be silenced by vows or miles. She had once believed that turning away was enough, but the figures told her otherwise. They were not just a message, they were a summons. And somewhere outside, the one who drew them was getting closer. The morning mist had settled over Ridlingthorpe Manor like a veil, softening every edge of the landscape outside and filtering the sunlight into a pale, silvery glow. It clung to the hedgerows, curled around the chimneys, and drifted slowly across the gravel paths that wove through the garden like quiet thoughts. Within the house, all was hushed. The staff moved in careful silence. No laughter, no clatter of dishes or cheerful humming, just the sound of the clock in the main hallway, ticking steadily toward something no one could name. Elsie Cubitt had not left her room. She had not spoken more than a few words since the last note had appeared. Holmes had not seen her yet. She had politely declined a meeting, but from what Hilton had quietly shared that morning, her condition was worsening. She ate little, slept in short, fitful intervals, and often stood for long stretches at the window, unmoving, her hand resting gently against the glass, as if trying to feel the air outside without opening it. Holmes, however, made no attempt to force contact. He understood well enough that certain truths must surface on their own. And besides, her silence spoke volumes. Fear had settled deep in her bones, not the kind that causes people to scream or flee, but the heavier, quieter kind. The kind that made one withdraw, bit by bit, from everything safe, everything real. The kind that shaped its victims from within. He spent the morning walking the perimeter of the estate, his eyes scanning the outbuildings, the far hedges, the slight indentations in the ground near windows where a careful foot might have pressed into the soft earth. He studied the pattern of access points, the habits of the household staff, the exact schedule of comings and goings, and, most of all, the sight lines, angles from which the house could be observed without the observer being seen in return. The person who delivered the messages, Holmes concluded, was no common mischief maker. He was disciplined, precise, familiar with the layout and rhythm of the estate. He did not attempt to confront. He infiltrated the edges, left his mark, and disappeared. Not a brute, a strategist, and that, more than any weapon, made him dangerous. By late morning, Holmes had returned to the house and was seated once more in the library, sorting the messages with Watson, comparing the spacing, the frequency of repeated figures, the number of characters per grouping. This one, he said, tapping a note with 3 repeated stickmen in close sequence, bears the psychological hallmark of pressure. There is urgency here. The writer expects a response. He's no longer signaling a presence. He's demanding something. Watson, who had by now developed a quiet empathy for the woman they had yet to meet, asked gently, "Do you think she still believes silence will protect her?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He looked toward the fireplace where the logs had burned down to a warm glow. "I believe she is afraid that if she speaks, something worse will follow. And I also believe that her silence has already done all it can." Now it only delays the inevitable. That afternoon, as the house settled into a hush once more, a soft knock came to Holmes's door. It was Hilton Cubitt, his voice low, his expression deeply strained. "She's asked to see you." Holmes rose at once, but without hurry. He gathered nothing but a single sheet of plain paper and a pencil, and followed Hilton silently up the stairs. Elsie Cubitt's room was near the end of the hallway, its door painted a soft cream, its handle brass, polished to a dull shine. Hilton knocked once, gently, and opened the door with quiet reverence. The room was bright but sparse. Lace curtains drawn halfway, a small writing desk near the window, and a single armchair by the fireplace. Elsie sat in that chair upright, hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a simple gray dress, and though her features were delicate and composed, it was clear she had not slept well. Her eyes, rimmed with shadows, held none of the distance Holmes had expected. Instead, they were alert and terribly, terribly tired. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. Holmes inclined his head. "I am here to help, Mrs. Cubitt. Nothing more, nothing less." She glanced toward Hilton, who lingered by the door, uncertain. "Please, give us a moment." Her husband hesitated. Then, with a subtle nod, he stepped into the hallway and pulled the door quietly closed. For a time, neither Holmes nor Elsie spoke. The fire crackled faintly between them. The moment stretched, not uncomfortably, but heavily. Finally, she spoke again. "I should have told him everything before we were married. I know that now. I thought I could keep it behind me. But it followed me here, like a shadow you forget to watch." Holmes did not interrupt. She looked down at her hands, which had remained perfectly still in her lap. "The man who is sending those messages, he is not a stranger to me. His name is Abe Slaney. He is, or was, a part of something I once knew too well. He was never just an admirer. He was an enforcer, a man who used charm to mask violence. He was once close to my family, too close." She paused. "I left Chicago to get away from him, from all of them. I changed everything, my name, my life. I believed I could begin again. But he found me." Holmes remained still, absorbing every word. "And the drawings? We used them as children. They were a game once. Later he turned them into something else, a way to pass notes without the police understanding. Every figure is a letter. The positions mean something. We used it in the wrong places, in the wrong company. And now he's using it to tell me he's here, that he remembers, that I owe him something, that I must answer. Do you intend to?" She met his eyes for the first time. "No, not now, not ever." Holmes set the paper and pencil on the table. "Then write down everything you remember about the code, every letter, every figure. It is the key to everything that follows." And in that quiet room, where the past and present now met without disguise, Elsie Cubitt began to reclaim a language she had spent years trying to forget. The late afternoon light had dimmed into a gentle gray by the time Holmes left Elsie Cubitt's room. As he closed the door behind him with careful quiet, he found Hilton waiting just down the hallway, standing with the stillness of someone bracing for words he might not want to hear. Holmes gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, one that offered reassurance without promise, and moved past him without speaking, allowing the silence to linger. Some truths needed time to settle before being shared. Back downstairs in the library, Holmes placed the folded page from Elsie carefully on the center of the table, smoothing it with both hands. The sheet was now marked with rows of symbols, stick figure drawings, yes, but this time each one was accompanied by its corresponding letter, a complete cipher key written in the neat, careful hand of a woman who had once learned the system as a kind of code between friends, then later used it as a survival mechanism, and now finally had surrendered it to justice. Watson, who had been pacing the floor quietly in Holmes's absence, turned immediately when he entered. "You've seen her?" "I have." "And?" "She has confirmed our suspicions. The sender is indeed someone from her past, a man named Abe Slaney, more than an admirer, less than a stranger. He is persistent, possibly dangerous, and he speaks to her in a language she once helped create." Holmes sat at the table and tapped his fingers lightly against the newly written cipher chart. "And now, so do I." Watson came closer, glancing at the page. "So she remembers every letter, every figure. She reconstructed the full code from memory. It is, in essence, a substitution cipher. Each dancing man, each posture, corresponds to a single letter of the alphabet. Some have flags, others do not. The variations are subtle but precise." He picked up one of the previously received notes, now worn at the edges from handling, and began matching the figures against the code. "This message, for instance," he murmured, translating silently as he went. Watson watched as Holmes moved across the page with increasing speed, marking each figure, pausing occasionally to consider a repeating sequence or a deliberate space between groups. He flipped to another note, then another, cross-referencing symbols, now confirming what had only been educated guesses. "They all speak to her directly," Holmes said. "Each message is intimate. There is history behind the words, but the tone has shifted with each one. The first was mild, tentative, then came insistence, then veiled threats, and now desperation. This man has waited for her to respond. She has not. So he presses harder." He looked up from the table. "Watson, we are not dealing with random intimidation. We are watching a psychological escalation. The danger grows not because he is losing control, but because he is methodical. He increases pressure the way one tightens a screw." Watson, troubled, sat opposite him. "How long do you think we have before he acts?" Holmes turned his eyes back to the symbols. "Not long." He placed a finger firmly on the latest message. 4 figures in a tight cluster, separated from the rest. "This here, this is no longer merely a call. This is an instruction. And the message that followed it, found this morning, was not only urgent, it was final." Watson's face tensed. "Do you think he's nearby? Still watching?" Holmes nodded. "I am certain of it. These messages are not being sent from a distance. They are delivered in person, quietly, at night, with familiarity of the grounds and confidence of access. He is near, Watson. Perhaps in the village, perhaps watching us at this very moment." Watson looked toward the window where the sun had dipped behind the hedgerows, painting the horizon with the dim hues of approaching dusk. The fields were still. The trees rustled softly in the wind, but somewhere out there, hidden in the gentle curves of the landscape, a man waited, one who had crossed an ocean, not for reconciliation, but for possession, and he would not wait forever. Holmes leaned back in his chair and reached for his notebook. "From now on, I want copies made of every new message immediately, full records, each drawing, each grouping, each repetition. I intend to trace the evolution of this man's thinking by the messages he leaves behind. They are as telling as fingerprints, more so perhaps, because they reveal not only identity but intention." He paused, then added almost absently, "And I want a watch placed on the southern edge of the property. There is a weakness in the hedgerow fencing there. A man could approach the manor on foot without being seen. If I were him, that is where I would come from." Watson rose to see that the instruction was passed on, and Holmes, left alone with the symbols, studied them again, this time not as puzzles, but as sentences written by a man who believed the past could be reclaimed by force, and who had chosen to speak not through violence, yet, but through a child's code, twisted into something darker. He closed his eyes for a moment and whispered quietly to himself, "Speak a language long enough." And eventually someone answers back. Night had fully descended upon Ridlingthorpe Manor. The wind shifted across the fields with a soft, deliberate hush, stirring the trees and rustling through the grass, as if nature itself sensed the fragile tension nesting inside the house. Candles flickered in narrow corridors, shadows leaned long across polished floorboards. And in the drawing room, Sherlock Holmes sat alone at a table turned makeshift decoding station, the rest of the household gone quiet for the night. A single oil lamp cast its amber glow over the scattered papers in front of him. The drawings, crude stick figures once innocent in appearance, now seemed to radiate a silent pressure, their bent limbs and tiny flags no longer random but loaded with hidden speech. To the uninformed eye, they were mere scribbles, but to Holmes, they were paragraphs, chapters, a story unfolding through posture and rhythm. He had sorted them into chronological order, each message carefully numbered and pinned in place along a wide sheet of canvas that stretched across the tabletop. The cipher key, courtesy of Elsie Cubitt, lay beside him. And now, with silence as his companion and the methodical breath of the house ticking like a slow metronome, he began the work of extracting language from these shapes. He started with the first note, the one scrawled in chalk on the garden shed door, a short sequence of 5 figures. One appeared twice, its arms angled upward, no flag on its side. He matched it to the cipher, the letter E, the most common letter in the English alphabet. A good place to begin. From there, he moved to the others. One by one, each figure found its corresponding letter. He murmured them as he worked, not to speak, but to internalize the sequence. E-L-S-I-E, a name, hers. A message meant to catch her attention, not to communicate anything else, but to announce a presence. The second note came on paper, found tucked beneath the kitchen door. A longer sequence, more complex. As Holmes mapped it against the cipher, the letters began to form. A-R-E-Y-O-U-R-E-A-D-Y. Are you ready? A challenge. Not a greeting, not a threat. A question, loaded, provocative, one that presumed history and demanded response. Holmes continued through the messages, now gaining speed. Each revealed not only more about the sender's intent, but his state of mind. The third message, E-L-S-I-E-R-E-Z-I-S-T. He paused. Resist. A misspelling or a deliberate alteration, perhaps phonetic, perhaps a mistake from haste or emotional urgency. It was likely meant to read, resist. The meaning was not lost on him. Abe Slaney, if he was indeed the author of these notes, was pleading or ordering her to resist something. But what? A decision? A new life? Holmes suspected that each message was building toward something not yet said, but inevitable. He leaned back and closed his eyes. A code is never just about letters. It's about intent. It's about emotion passed through disguise. Each choice, when to write, where to leave it, how much to say, is a fingerprint of the mind behind the ink. He opened his eyes again and turned to the most recent message, one found just a day ago, wedged into the edge of a window frame. This one was different, fewer symbols, spaced wider, the dancing men more spread out. Holmes translated slowly, letting the figures reveal their secrets on their own terms. E-L-S-I-E-M-E-E T-M-E, meet me. Now the tone had shifted. No longer abstract, no longer merely pressing for acknowledgement. It was an invitation, or worse, an ultimatum. There were no threats in plain terms, but the direction was unmistakable. Slaney was escalating, growing bolder, confident that her silence was nearing its end. Holmes made several notes beneath the cipher grid. He tracked the emotional arc of each message, from recognition to confrontation to appeal, and now demand. The last page in the stack, unmarked, lay blank but for a faint smudge along one edge. Holmes turned it under the lamplight. There, almost invisible, was a fingerprint in charcoal or soot, likely from the edge of a doorframe or window ledge. A right index, faint ridge patterns barely visible. He made a careful note of it, not because it would identify the sender on its own, but because it confirmed proximity. Slaney had not mailed these. He had delivered them himself. He had been here not long ago, likely close enough to observe Elsie's reaction through a window or hear footsteps in the hall. He was not only sending messages, he was watching. Holmes returned to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to look out. The garden beyond was swallowed in darkness, the hedges casting long black lines over the lawn, the trees whispering softly in the wind. All seemed calm, but Holmes knew better. Behind one of those hedgerows, a man could lie low, unseen, for hours. Behind the stable, a dry hollow beneath the eaves could provide shelter. He had already noted the vulnerable spots in the fencing. Ridlingthorpe, for all its charm and tranquility, was not designed for surveillance. It was open, welcoming, exposed. Watson entered quietly, bringing a tray with tea and bread, setting it down without comment. He looked over the table of decoded pages. What do they say? They say he's close, closer than she thinks, and he's growing impatient. Watson studied the final message, and if she doesn't meet him, then I fear he won't ask again. Holmes picked up the latest note and stared at it once more. He's not bluffing. His language may be indirect, but his actions are not. He's moving in a straight line, and we are running out of room between what he wants and what he is willing to take. He stood, closing his notebook. We must watch the house tonight. Every corner, every window, quietly. He will come again, and when he does, he will expect to find only silence waiting for him. But this time, we will be listening. Morning broke gently over Ridlingthorpe Manor, the kind of early light that moves slowly through the mist, brushing across the upper windows like the careful hand of someone hesitant to wake a sleeping child. The fog still clung low to the fields, thin and weightless, disappearing in slow ribbons as the sun began to rise behind the distant treetops. Birds called in short, uncertain melodies, and somewhere on the far side of the estate, a dog barked once, then fell silent again. Inside the manor, the household stirred in measured, quiet movements. A kettle hissed in the kitchen. Footsteps passed along the upper corridor. But in the drawing room, where Holmes had spent most of the night in quiet observation, no one spoke. Holmes himself had slept little, preferring instead to sit near the window, eyes fixed on the shadows that moved across the lawn, listening to the subtle rhythms of the house and its surroundings. Watson entered just after dawn with 2 cups of tea and a weary look in his eyes. Nothing last night. No movement, no new sounds, no trace of passage on the garden path. Either he's grown more cautious, or he's waiting for something else. They both stood near the wide windows, looking out over the morning lawn. The air was still, the colors washed in soft hues of green and gray. Then, just as the silence began to feel too still, too long, Hilton Cubitt appeared in the doorway. It came again. His voice was quiet, steady, but carried with it the unmistakable edge of urgency. Holmes turned at once, stepping toward him. Where? The front door. This time it was tucked behind the iron boot scraper. I stepped outside barely 10 minutes ago and saw the edge of it sticking out. Same paper, same ink. Holmes took the folded note carefully. The paper was thin and creased, damp at the edges from the morning dew. He unfolded it with precise fingers and laid it on the nearby table, smoothing it flat beneath his palm. This message was longer than the others, much longer. 11 figures in all, drawn in a deliberate line, evenly spaced, each one standing in its distinct pose, arms lifted, twisted, raised, sometimes flagged. The dancing men were back, but this time they carried more than warning, they carried weight. Holmes pulled the cipher sheet from his coat pocket and began working the message immediately, his hand moving in sharp, clean lines as he matched figure to letter, pausing only briefly to confirm his analysis. He spoke slowly as the letters formed beneath his pencil. E-L-S-I-E-P-R-E-P-I-R-E. He paused. Watson leaned in. Prepare? Holmes resumed, his voice lower now. T-O-M-E-E-T. Another pause. T-G-Y. Watson's brow tensed. God. Holmes sat back. Elsie, prepare to meet thy God. A long silence filled the room, stretching as the words settled into the quiet like smoke. Even Hilton Cubitt, not a man easily shaken, took a step back and lowered his gaze. Holmes stood slowly. This is not a metaphor. This is not the ranting of a confused admirer. This is a threat, and it is final. Watson's voice was soft but steady. He intends to kill her. Holmes nodded, or force her to do something worse. Either way, he is done asking. Hilton moved toward the table, his hands gripping the edge tightly. You said before he was getting desperate that he might push. Now he has, and he will not wait much longer. Holmes turned back toward the window, his eyes narrowed. This is the moment we've been preparing for. The moment when the game turns real. He believes he's broken her silence, that she will now come to him, or that she has no choice but to surrender. And if she doesn't, then he will come for her himself. Watson looked out toward the fields beyond the house, the hedgerows still dripping with the last of the mist. There was no movement, no visible presence, but the message, delivered quietly, left with care, was enough. He had been there. He had approached again, and no one had seen him. Holmes returned to the table and began copying the message by hand, this time with a separate sheet for evidence. His strokes were deliberate, and he left margin notes beside each figure, timing, position, emotional tone. He is more than close. He is watching her reactions, timing them, adjusting his pressure based on what she does and what she does not do. Watson asked quietly, "What do we do now?" Holmes looked up, the weight of certainty in his eyes. Now, we prepare him a message of our own. The message sat at the center of the table like a ticking clock no one could hear. Elsie, prepare to meet thy God. The words, formed through simple lines and childish figures, carried no noise, no fire, no weapon, only the certainty of intent, and that made it all the more dangerous. Holmes had seen threats in many forms, but there was something uniquely cruel in this one. Not only had it reached her in silence, it had used her own childhood code to do it. A language that had once been harmless, now twisted into a final verdict. Elsie did not react with outcry or panic when shown the message. She merely lowered her eyes, folded her hands in her lap, and nodded, as if confirming something she had already long feared. "He has made his decision," she said. Holmes studied her carefully. Despite the pale hue of her face, Her voice was calm, steady, but in her stillness there was no resignation, only a kind of quiet resolve. "He expects you to respond," Holmes said. "This is not a threat sent in ignorance. This is carefully chosen language. It mirrors scripture, an executioner's phrase, the sort of thing said by someone who does not wish to leave evidence. He doesn't plan to write again." Elsie looked away toward the garden window. "Then you believe he's coming?" "Not believe. I know. It will be tonight. Tomorrow at the latest, he is done waiting. The threat has been issued, and the hour of action will follow. That is how men like Slaney move." She did not answer. Holmes continued, "The question now is not if he will come, but whether we will be ready when he does." Downstairs, Holmes and Watson met again with Hilton Cubitt, the atmosphere now tight with urgency. The Manor's wide halls and creaking floorboards suddenly seemed too large, too open, the very charm of the house now a liability. Holmes laid out the plan in short, precise sentences. He will come either after nightfall or just before dawn. Those are his hours. Quiet, soft light, minimal movement in the house. He will approach from the south, along the hedge line. That much is clear from the tracks we found yesterday. "You're certain?" Hilton asked. "I am. He favors concealment and familiarity. He studied your routines. He knows your dog does not bark unless startled directly. He knows the staff sleep deeply. He also knows that you are not a man who typically carries a weapon." Hilton said nothing. Holmes continued, "Tonight I want you and Mrs. Cubitt to remain in your room. Lock the door. Bolt it. Do not open it for anything unless you hear my voice speak clearly." "And where will you be?" Holmes turned toward the staircase. "Here, watching the hallway, watching the grounds. Watson will cover the rear entrance. I will be just outside your bedroom, armed, silent, and prepared. I will not allow him to pass." Watson glanced toward the window. "And if he tries to break in another way, then he will find the police waiting for him outside. I've sent word, discreetly. Lestrade is sending 2 constables. They'll arrive by nightfall and remain hidden near the perimeter." Hilton clenched his jaw. "If I see him myself, I will not hesitate." Holmes looked at him firmly. "I understand that, but I ask that you let us handle it. Slaney wants a confrontation. If he sees you, he will escalate immediately. He will assume you are the only obstacle between him and your wife. We cannot allow that." Hilton took a long breath, then nodded. As the afternoon wore into evening, preparations moved quietly but deliberately. Watson reviewed the vantage points from the second-floor windows, carefully noting where lantern light would interfere with visibility. Holmes walked the grounds again, memorizing every approach, every possible hiding place, every shadow that could become a doorway for a man like Slaney. He mapped it in his mind like a stage. When the sun fell, the house was darkened deliberately. No lanterns on the upper floors. No fires lit after 9. The constables took their places, one near the hedge, the other in the stable yard. Watson remained on the rear staircase, concealed by the curve of the wall. And Holmes, dressed in his dark coat, positioned himself just outside the master bedroom door, crouched in the shadows, revolver in hand, every sense attuned to the silence. Time passed. The house breathed in its quiet rhythm, the slow tick of the grandfather clock below, the occasional groan of the timber under wind. From outside, the soft rustle of trees, a distant owl, the rhythm of a night like any other. Then, just after 3 in the morning, Holmes heard it. The faintest scrape of gravel, a careful step, then another. Too slow to be a servant, too measured to be animal. He pressed himself against the wall, listening. The footfalls moved toward the house. Another pause. A second sound. Metal. The gentle tap of something against the lower window frame. Then silence. Holmes raised his revolver, breath held. The man was here, and he had brought the final warning with him. The footsteps stopped just outside the house, and then, for nearly a full minute, there was nothing. Not a breath of wind, not a creak of wood, not even the rustle of a branch outside. Holmes remained crouched beside the door of the master bedroom, motionless, his breathing so shallow it barely stirred the air. The silence felt unnatural, as though the night itself had gone still to watch what would happen next. Then came the sound again, barely audible. A soft scratch of paper against stone. Someone was tucking something into the frame of a lower window, just as they had done before. But this time, Holmes didn't rush to intercept. He waited. He needed the intruder to move, to show more of himself, to stretch just a little beyond the edges of safety. Watson, hidden by the curved rear staircase, heard it too, the whisper of footsteps shifting over gravel just outside the rear kitchen wall. He raised the lantern's shutter ever so slightly and caught the outline of a tall figure moving low beneath the dining room window. Slender build, confident movements, not hurried but cautious. The man was alone. Back on the upper floor, Holmes heard the soft pad of boots on the grass again, moving now toward the side of the house where the bedroom windows faced the eastern garden. It was precisely what he had anticipated. Slaney was probing, circling the house before making a more direct approach. He was looking for an opening, or for Elsie. Downstairs, the constable nearest the hedge stepped quietly from his position and took cover behind the base of a wide oak tree, his eyes fixed on the movement near the garden. The second constable remained at the stable-yard gate, revolver drawn, waiting for the signal. Then something changed. The footsteps ceased altogether. For nearly 5 minutes, no one moved. No sound came. Holmes strained to hear. Had the intruder retreated? Had he seen something? Sensed the trap? Just then Watson's voice rose, not loudly but firmly from the floor below. "There's something at the north door." Holmes moved swiftly but silently down the hall, stepping like a shadow through the dark. He passed the staircase without descending and leaned over the banister just enough to signal Watson with a subtle motion of his hand. "Hold position." Watson gave the slightest nod in return. Holmes then turned back and took a longer route down, circling toward the front entrance where the last of the light from the moon spilled in through the frosted glass. He moved with trained precision, his revolver tucked close to his chest, every step deliberate. When he reached the front hallway, he paused and waited behind the entryway arch, listening. Then he heard it, soft, almost tender, the creak of the outer handle. Someone was testing the latch. Holmes stepped to the edge of the door and placed his fingers on the inside lock. He did not move it, only prepared himself to do so in a single sudden motion. He glanced down at the floorboards, no movement in the shadows, no silhouette through the glass. Then the sound stopped. Another silence. And then footsteps again, moving quickly now, back toward the garden. Holmes realized at once what had happened. He's not here to enter. He's watching for response. Holmes opened the door slowly and stepped outside into the crisp night air. The grass was wet beneath his boots. He scanned the shadows. There, just beyond the hedge, a shape, a man, stood motionless. Holmes did not speak. He didn't move forward. He raised his revolver and kept it trained. The man turned his head slightly, just enough to know he had been seen, but then, without a word, he backed away. One step, then another, and then he was gone, disappeared into the cover of the trees beyond the eastern field. Holmes did not follow, not yet. Instead, he turned and knelt by the window frame where the paper had been left. He retrieved it, unfolded it under the moonlight, and scanned the symbols. A short message, just 4 characters this time, each one now familiar. T-O-N-I-T-E Holmes closed his hand around the note. Tonight. It had never been a question. He returned inside, where Watson was already ascending the stairs to meet him. "You saw him?" Briefly. Watson's brow furrowed. "Was he armed?" "No weapon that I could see." "But confidence. He's not a man sneaking about. He walks like someone who believes he owns the outcome, and that makes him unpredictable." They returned upstairs to the hallway outside the Cubit's room. Holmes knocked gently. 3 soft taps. Hilton opened the door slightly, peering out. Holmes handed him the note. "We were right. It's tonight." Hilton's face tightened. "Is she safe?" "Yes, but now we know for certain. He's coming, and he won't ask again." Holmes stepped back, voice low. "You stay inside. Watson and I will handle him." Hilton closed the door slowly, locking it behind him with a click. Holmes turned to Watson, both men standing in the corridor, as the long silence settled again around them. "Now, Watson, we wait." The journey to Ridlingthorpe Manor, though taken earlier in the timeline than the confrontation just passed, marked the critical turning point when observation transformed into direct involvement. It was the moment Sherlock Holmes chose to step beyond the comfortable corridors of 221B Baker Street and insert himself into the quiet, unraveling life of Hilton and Elsie Cubitt. The urgency had not yet peaked, but the signs of a gathering storm were already unmistakable. Holmes had made the decision swiftly. After reviewing the escalating sequence of messages, after studying the growing emotional tension in the symbols, and, most importantly, after seeing the subtle patterns in timing and tone, he turned to Watson and gave the command without hesitation. "We leave for Norfolk at first light." The following morning, the train rumbled steadily through the English countryside, winding its way north through wide green pastures, mist-laced woods, and sleepy villages tucked along winding rivers. Holmes spent much of the journey seated by the window, not lost in thought, but deeply focused. His long fingers hovered over the cipher chart as he revised his notes, building a mental model of the man they were about to confront, not merely through deduction, but through psychological signature. Watson, meanwhile, read quietly beside him, occasionally watching Holmes in silence. He recognized the shift. Holmes's calm was never disrupted, but his stillness had taken on a new quality, no longer passive, but poised, like a predator watching the shape of the wind. They arrived at the local station in Norfolk just after noon. The platform was nearly empty, the station master nodding politely as they disembarked, then pointing them toward the waiting carriage that Hilton Cubitt had sent. The air here was clean and still, the countryside wide open and quiet. But for Holmes, the quiet was deceptive. Every peaceful stretch of grass, every hedgerow, every small rise in the landscape held the potential for concealment. As the carriage bumped along the narrow road toward Ridlingthorpe Manor, Holmes observed everything: the position of the sun, the density of the trees along the edges of the estate, the height of the fences, the slope of the garden path leading to the front steps. Watson knew better than to interrupt him. Holmes's silence meant the landscape itself was already being processed, catalogued, measured, converted into points of entry and fields of visibility. They arrived at the manor in the early afternoon. Hilton Cubitt greeted them at the door, his demeanor the same, courteous, composed, but with a tightness in his jaw that had not been present in London. He looked thinner, tired. The polite formalities were exchanged quickly, but Holmes wasted no time before asking to be taken through the house. They toured every room, Holmes noted the thickness of the doors, the sight lines from each window, the creak patterns in the floorboards. He examined the exterior of the house in equal detail, the orientation of the garden, the slope of the land, the line of trees in the distance that could conceal a person for hours. When they reached the stables, Holmes paused beside the wall where one of the earlier messages had been left. He placed his palm against the timber and closed his eyes for a breath. Then he turned sharply to Watson. "This man knows the land. He's not guessing where to move. He's rehearsed it. Every approach, every escape route. He's not experimenting. He's executing a plan he's walked in his mind a dozen times already." They returned inside where tea had been prepared. Elsie was nowhere in sight. Hilton explained gently that she had taken to her room, her energy waning more with each new message. Holmes made no request to speak with her yet. He understood that this visit was not about interrogation, but protection. Over tea, Hilton shared the most recent details. The third note, the late-night sound near the west lawn, the way Elsie had begun to sleep with her door locked and a chair wedged beneath the handle. She said little, Hilton explained, but she no longer tried to hide her fear. "It's in her eyes now," he said, "like she's watching something that hasn't quite appeared, but will." Holmes looked up from his notes, and she's right, it will. The remainder of the day passed in structured preparation. Holmes examined each location where the figures had appeared. He created sketches of the property layout. He interviewed the staff briefly, not for gossip, but to understand patterns: who walked the grounds and when, who locked the doors at night, who might have left an entry point unsecured. His questions were always precise, never speculative. By dusk, Holmes had formed his plan. We don't wait for him to act. We act first, but not with confrontation, with comprehension. We must understand every layer of his strategy before he makes his move. Only then can we anticipate it. He returned to the drawing room after supper, laying out his materials on the long table. By lantern light, he studied the messages again, this time with the full cipher in hand and the voice of the woman who had created it echoing quietly behind the figures. Watson came in just before midnight, carrying a fresh pot of tea and an oil lantern. He stood behind Holmes, watching as the detective matched symbol to symbol, letter to letter, message to message. "There's a strange elegance to it," Watson said quietly. "The code, I mean." Holmes did not look up. Elegance, yes, and control. The kind used by people who need to hide in plain sight, criminals perhaps, but also those who have been hunted. Watson said nothing more. He knew that the story was shifting now from puzzle to pursuit. Holmes looked out the window once more. The trees beyond the garden were dark, unmoving. Somewhere in those trees, the past was waiting. The following morning began with a hush that felt unnatural. Riedling Thorpe Manor stood quiet beneath a pale sky, the light diffused by a soft fog that had crept in during the night and lingered across the fields like a breath held too long. The trees barely stirred. The leaves hung motionless. There was no rain, no wind, only the kind of stillness that made doors seem louder when they opened, and footsteps echo faintly in otherwise familiar halls. Inside, the house moved through its routines carefully, with the subtle awareness that something unwelcome was approaching. The staff spoke in subdued voices. Curtains were drawn more tightly than usual. Even the clatter of breakfast dishes had softened, as though the manor itself had entered a state of waiting. Holmes rose early, as always, and resumed his silent patrol of the grounds. He moved with methodical attention, stepping through the wet grass at the edges of the estate, examining footprints from the previous evening, and checking the places where someone might return, quiet hollows beneath hedgerows, Small gaps in the fence line, irregular dips in the earth where the heel of a boot might have pressed into damp soil. Each time he discovered one, he made note of it, not merely as a clue but as a piece of the man's mind, his preferred approach, his calculation of risk, his awareness of the terrain. Back inside, Watson sat with Hilton in the morning room, reviewing the previous night's observations and maintaining the calm that Hilton, for all his composure, clearly needed. The landowner was not a nervous man by nature, but the past week had worn him thin. His movements were slower now, and the expression in his eyes had changed, from concern to fear to something closer to grim readiness. Holmes returned just after mid-morning, wiping the dew from his gloves as he entered the room. He looked first at Hilton, then at Watson. He came close again last night, just shy of the orchard line. He didn't approach the house, but he watched. I found cigarette ash near the fence and a mark from a shoulder pressed into the bark of an elm tree. He was there for nearly an hour. Hilton stood slowly, his voice low. Then he's planning something for tonight? Holmes didn't answer right away. He moved to the map of the estate that he had spread out over the writing table and placed a small stone marker where the ash had been found. He's testing us, watching for a change in the house's routine. If he notices any new behavior, lights in rooms that are usually dark, footprints that aren't yours, voices in the wrong places, he'll adjust. We must give him the illusion that nothing has changed. He turned back to the others. Tonight, you and Elsie will remain upstairs. No deviation. You'll leave a small lamp burning as usual. Your bedroom door will stay locked. Do not answer unless I call you by name. And if he comes in, he won't? Not without tipping his hand. He's careful. But if he tries, Watson and I will intercept him before he crosses the threshold. Hilton nodded. Holmes's calm was contagious, his words deliberate, never rushed, never loud. It was the kind of calm that came not from ignorance of danger, but from knowing exactly where it lived. That afternoon passed slowly, the hours stretching out like a long breath held too tightly. Holmes took tea alone in the garden, his eyes following the path of clouds moving overhead. Occasionally, he would jot something in his notebook, a single word, a name, a pattern. Every once in a while, he'd pause, look at the tree line, and go still. Elsie did not come downstairs. Watson, walking past her room on the way to retrieve a journal from his luggage, heard her humming once, barely audible, a melody without rhythm, the kind of tune one hums when lost in thought. It was not a happy sound, but it was not despairing either. It was the sound of someone who had remembered something long buried and was unsure what to do with it. By evening, preparations were complete. 2 constables arrived from London as arranged by Holmes, dressed in plain clothes to avoid suspicion. One was stationed in the old mill house near the orchard, hidden behind a collapsing stone wall with a view of the eastern approach. The other remained near the stable, in the shadows just behind the rear gate, revolver drawn but concealed. They had clear instructions: watch, wait. Only act on Holmes's signal. Holmes and Watson dined lightly that evening. Bread, cold roast, and tea, speaking little. The lamplight flickered across the dining room walls, casting shadows that moved like thoughts unspoken. Outside, the sky grew darker, the edges of the property slowly swallowed by the approaching night. Watson, from his seat, asked quietly, "Do you think he'll come directly?" Holmes did not look up from his tea. "No, he's not ready for confrontation. Not yet. He wants to frighten her into surrender. That's why he left the last message when he knew she would find it. That's why he waited nearby. And if she doesn't yield, then he'll act, but not recklessly. He'll try again to draw her out, using the one method he believes still holds power: her past. Watson leaned back. And if that fails? Holmes met his gaze. Then he'll stop asking. They left the dining room in silence and took their positions. Holmes returned to the second-floor corridor outside the cubit's room, where the shadows stretched long across the floor. He knelt by the window, which offered a partial view of the eastern garden. He extinguished all lamps except the one in the master bedroom behind him. Watson descended to his post on the back stair, concealed by a deep curve in the wall. The constables were in place. The house was quiet. The night had begun, and somewhere beyond the trees, a man waited, watching, deciding. Holmes rested his hand on the revolver tucked into his coat. The storm, long promised, was about to break. The hour was past midnight, when the stillness of Ridlingthorpe Manor reached its peak. Not the comfortable stillness of a country house tucked into restful sleep, but a heavier quiet, one that stretched across floorboards and curtain folds, winding through darkened stairwells and empty halls like a presence in the room that no one could name. Sherlock Holmes remained crouched just beyond the corner of the upper corridor, beside a narrow window that faced the eastern garden. His outline blended into the wall. His breath was shallow, inaudible. His eyes had not left the yard for over an hour. Below him, in the shadows of the servants' stairwell, Watson sat with his revolver resting quietly in his lap, back against the wall, ears attuned to every creak of timber, every rustle of wind. He, too, had not moved in a long while. The two constables, one hidden by the orchard's stone wall, the other stationed near the stable gate, were in place, their instructions clear. No lanterns, no shouts, no mistakes. In the room behind Holmes, the master bedroom was dimly lit. A soft glow filtered out beneath the door, its angle deliberate, visible from the lawn, just enough to suggest that all was normal within. The curtain had been left partly open, a book carelessly placed on the nightstand, as if Hilton and Elsie Cubitt had retired like any other night. But it was not like any other night. Holmes's instincts had not failed him once during the case, and they didn't fail now. Something was coming. He could feel it not through sound or motion, but through the change in atmosphere. The air pressed differently against the glass. The shadows along the treetops felt more defined. Even the birds, which normally stirred with a brief flutter before dawn, had not moved. The countryside was holding its breath. Then, at last, movement. A shape emerged from the dark margin beyond the orchard. Subtle, a figure low to the ground, cutting carefully across the grass. Not running, gliding, measured. The man was tall, slender, his coat close-fitting. His movements were confident, practiced, not the uncertain creep of a petty thief, but the deliberate approach of someone who had done this before. Holmes narrowed his eyes, following the man's every shift of weight. The intruder paused near the edge of the garden wall, partially obscured by a wide bush. He stood there for a full minute, watching the lit window above, watching her. Holmes turned his head slightly and tapped twice on the wooden floor beside him. Watson heard it and straightened. Silent acknowledgement. The man moved again. He stepped out from behind the bush, advancing across the garden path, careful not to disturb the gravel. When he reached the base of the wall, just below the bedroom window, he stopped. Reaching into his coat, he retrieved something. Holmes could not see what. Then, slowly, he looked up. There was no fear in his posture, only expectation. Holmes recognized the stance immediately. He believes she's watching him. The man raised one hand toward the window, fingers outstretched, not waving, not signaling, just holding still. Then, after a pause, he placed something small along the windowsill. He stepped back. It was another message. The figure waited, A full minute passed, then 2. Still no movement from within the house. He shifted. Holmes could see the change. The man's confidence began to falter just slightly. He glanced left, then right, scanning the garden. Then his head turned and stopped. He had seen something. Holmes didn't move, didn't breathe. The man stared directly at the corridor window, not close enough to see the eyes behind it, but close enough to sense the presence of someone watching. The stillness between them was electric. 2 minds, one hidden, one exposed, each testing the other in silence. Then the man turned and began to retreat. Holmes waited until he had passed back through the tree line before stepping from the wall, straightening to full height. He opened the window slowly, leaned out, and retrieved the message. A thin slip of paper, damp at the edges from dew. He unfolded it beneath the moonlight. Only 3 figures this time, but he knew what they meant before even translating. N-O-M-O-R-E, no more. Watson joined him in the corridor moments later, his face pale but steady. He was here? Yes. Did he see you? Not directly, but he felt it. And now he knows she's not coming. Watson read the message over Holmes's shoulder. What does it mean? It means he's finished waiting. Holmes stepped away from the window and looked toward the bedroom door, where a single line of light still glowed faintly beneath the threshold. It means whatever he came to do, he will do it soon. It was nearly 4 in the morning when the shot rang out. Not loud, not dramatic, just a sharp metallic crack that sliced through the heavy silence of Ridlingthorpe Manor like the first note in a grim symphony. It echoed down the halls, rattled the windows faintly, and left the world frozen for half a second in disbelief. Then came the second shot. Closer, louder, final. Holmes was on his feet before the reverberation faded. The echo of the sound had barely left the walls when he lunged for the master bedroom door, his revolver drawn, heart steady, but pulse surging. Watson was just behind him, his boots thudding against the floorboards as he ascended the stairs 2 at a time. Holmes didn't wait for Hilton's voice, didn't call out. There was no time. He twisted the doorknob and slammed his shoulder into the door. It gave way with a dull crack of splintering wood. Inside, the room was shrouded in low light. The lamp on the side table still flickered dimly, casting a soft, flickering glow over the tragedy it now illuminated. Hilton Cubitt lay collapsed beside the bed, his body twisted unnaturally, one arm outstretched toward the hearth rug. Blood pooled beneath him, dark, thick, silent. A revolver lay inches from his fingers, unused. Elsie Cubitt was on the floor across the room, her back against the wardrobe. A second revolver, smaller, delicate, had slipped from her open hand and rested near the folds of her nightdress. Blood soaked the sleeve of her blouse, and her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. Watson dropped to his knees beside her without a word, already searching for a pulse. Holmes crouched over Hilton, but there was nothing to be done. The man's eyes were half open, but unfocused. His chest was still. His final breath had passed. Watson looked up, voice grim but composed. She's alive. Barely. The bullet grazed her side. Shallow entry. Near the ribs. But she's lost blood. We'll need to stabilize her. Holmes moved quickly, stripping the bed of its sheet and handing Watson what he needed. Within seconds, the doctor's hands were working with practiced speed, cleaning the wound, applying pressure, keeping her awake with firm but gentle commands. Elsie's eyes fluttered open once, met Watson's, then shifted to Holmes. She tried to speak, but no sound came, only a soft, broken exhale. "Don't move," Watson said. "You're safe now. You're safe." Holmes turned back to the scene, eyes sharp. 2 revolvers, one near Hilton, one near Elsie. 3 shots fired, that much was immediately clear. 2 bullets had struck Hilton, one through the shoulder, another to the chest. A third had embedded in the wall near the window, just above the curtain rod. And yet, there was no sign of forced entry, no shattered glass, no smashed locks. Holmes spoke under his breath. Someone else was in this room. Watson didn't look up. "You're certain?" "Absolutely. Look at the distance between the bodies, the trajectory of the bullet in the wall. The angle from which Hilton was shot. It came from the far side of the room, not from his wife's position." He moved carefully across the floor, examining the blood patterns, the scuff marks in the carpet, the arrangement of overturned items. A flower vase had shattered beside the dresser. A small chair had been knocked sideways. The wardrobe door was ajar. Then he found it, a boot mark, half-formed near the window. A man's boot, not Hilton's. Too long, too narrow. Holmes turned sharply to Watson. The shooter stood there, fired the first shot, shoulder. Hilton stumbled. He reached for the revolver, but didn't make it. Second shot, chest, fatal. Then Elsie. She either grabbed her own weapon or already had it in hand. Fired in panic, missed. Bullets struck the wall. She collapsed after that. Whether from the shock or her wound, we can't be certain yet. Watson finished dressing her injury, his voice low but urgent. "She'll survive, if we can keep her stable." Holmes nodded, eyes still scanning the room. "Then she'll tell us what happened, but I already know who did it." Watson looked up. "Slaney?" "Yes." And he wasn't trying to frighten her this time. He came for her. Hilton must have heard something and confronted him. He never had a chance. Holmes straightened. "There's one more thing." He moved to the edge of the bed, where something small had been left tucked under the coverlet. A folded piece of paper. Another message. He unfolded it slowly, the ink still fresh. Dancing men. 11 figures. And beneath them, in Slaney's unmistakable hand, "Elsie, prepare to meet thy God." Holmes stared at the note for a long moment. He left it here, in the room. He wanted her to read it after it was done, after the blood had dried. It was meant to be the last thing she saw. Watson looked down at Hilton's still form, but she lived. Holmes turned away, folding the note carefully. "Yes, and now she's the only one who can finish this." From the hallway came the sound of hurried footsteps. One of the constables, summoned by the gunfire, burst into view, eyes wide. "What happened?" Holmes's voice was sharp but measured. "Fetch the village doctor, and send word to the nearest magistrate. We've had a murder, and I intend to name the man who did it." By dawn, the sun had risen, but there was no warmth to it. The light crept cautiously across the estate, casting long shadows across the wet grass and the dew-dusted hedgerows. Birds resumed their soft morning calls, oblivious to the violence that had stained the quiet halls of Ridlingthorpe Manor just hours earlier. The house, now awake, carried a heavy silence, thicker than grief, deeper than shock. Inspector Lestrade arrived from London shortly after sunrise. He had taken the earliest train and came with 2 additional officers, their coats still dusted with soot from the city platforms. Lestrade greeted Holmes with a nod at the front door, offering no formalities. He could tell from the look on Holmes's face that this was no ordinary crime of passion or mistake of circumstance. "You said it was a murder," Lestrade said simply. "It is." Holmes led him directly to the master bedroom, where the body of Hilton Cubitt had been respectfully covered, and the scene left untouched, save for the essential medical intervention Watson had provided. Elsie had been moved to a guest room under Watson's care, her wound dressed and her condition stable but fragile. Holmes gestured to the doorway. 3 shots fired, 1 embedded in the wall above the window. 2 struck the victim, shoulder and chest. Revolver beside him unfired. He never had the chance. Lestrade knelt beside the covered body, carefully lifting the sheet. He studied Hilton's position, then the angle of the gun, then stood and examined the bullet hole in the far wall. And the woman, alive, wounded. She was found on the opposite side of the room with her own revolver. Bullet fired from that weapon is the one lodged in the wall. She never hit him. So you're ruling out a murder-suicide? Holmes shook his head without hesitation. It was made to look like one. But a third person was here, a man, tall, precise, calm under pressure. Slaney, Lestrade raised an eyebrow. You're certain? Holmes gestured for him to follow. Together they stepped through the room once more, as Holmes pointed out each telling detail. Here, scuff marks, deep pressure near the dresser. He waited here. When Hilton entered, the first shot struck his shoulder, disarming him. Second shot through the chest. Fatal. Elsie, likely in shock, fired wildly, missed. The bullet struck the wall, right here. Lestrade examined the indentation in the plaster. Close range? Less than 10 feet. And you have proof it wasn't the wife? Holmes nodded toward the boot print beside the curtain. That's not Hilton's. Too long, too narrow. It matches the earlier print I found outside, beneath the bedroom window. Same tread, same spacing. Lestrade turned, now fully engaged. And motive? Obsession? Control? Slaney followed Elsie from Chicago to England. He used an old cipher, the so-called dancing men, to try and force communication. When she refused, he escalated. Messages turned threatening. His last note, left in this room, proves intent. Holmes retrieved it from his coat pocket and handed it to Lestrade. Lestrade read the phrase slowly. Elsie, prepare to meet thy God. He folded the note with care, his brow darkened. So he came to kill her. The husband got in the way. Exactly? Lestrade was quiet for a long moment, then said, And what now? We find Slaney. He won't run far. He believes himself clever, but he's growing careless. I'll draw him in myself. Holmes stepped past Lestrade and motioned toward the hallway. But before we do that, I need to finish documenting the scene. He left more than a bullet trail. There are answers here he didn't intend to leave behind. Holmes moved through the bedroom with the precision of a man who wasn't just seeing a crime. He was reading a confession hidden in the layout of space and silence. He paused beside the fireplace and lifted a broken piece of porcelain from the rug. A teacup. Likely dropped during the struggle, Watson said from the doorway. Holmes nodded. Then, here, the book on the floor, not knocked over, dropped. Open to a page on revolver maintenance. He turned to Lestrade. Hilton had been preparing. He knew Slaney was coming. He just didn't know when or how close he already was. He crouched once more beside the window where the curtains had been drawn back too far. And this, deliberate. Slaney wanted Elsie to see him before he entered, to recognize him, to fear him, to freeze. Lestrade ran a hand through his hair. So this was premeditated, not rage, not reaction, cold intention. Holmes looked down at Hilton's still body, his expression unreadable. Yes, and Hilton died protecting a woman he loved, one who had tried every way she knew to shield him from the darkness behind her. Watson approached quietly, his voice measured. She's awake. Holmes looked toward the hallway. Is she ready to speak? She asked for you. Holmes turned to Lestrade. I'll get the rest of the story from her, but not as an inspector, as a man she trusts. She's held on to silence too long. She deserves to give her version before you take it down in ink. Lestrade gave a slow nod, and Holmes stepped away from the crime scene, leaving behind the evidence. Revolvers, footprints, blood, shattered porcelain, and walked down the hall toward the voice that could confirm what the room had already said. The guest room, where Elsie Cubitt had been moved, was small, quiet, and bathed in soft morning light. The curtains were drawn halfway, letting in the gentle shimmer of the Norfolk sunrise, and the only sounds were the muffled murmurs of staff moving downstairs and the occasional distant cry of a bird in the hedgerow. Elsie lay propped against two pillows, her face pale, but her eyes alert. There was a stillness in her expression, one Holmes had come to recognize in people who had passed through the worst and no longer feared what came next. Watson sat beside her, checking her pulse, adjusting the bindings of the wound near her ribs. Her breath was shallow but steady. When Holmes entered, she met his gaze immediately. "You saw him, didn't you?" she asked softly. Holmes took the chair across from her and nodded once, briefly. "Not enough to stop him, but enough to know we'll find him. And we will." She closed her eyes for a long moment, her lips parting slightly as if letting go of something she'd held in silence. "Then I'll tell you what I remember." Holmes said nothing. He simply listened, letting the rhythm of her words guide the moment. "He came into the room just after 3. I heard a noise at the window, then the door opened. I don't know how he got inside. Maybe it was unlocked. Maybe he forced it quietly. He didn't say anything right away, just stood there." "Was Hilton already awake?" Holmes asked. She nodded. "He was up. Reading, I think. He kept his revolver close ever since the last message. I told him not to, but he refused to sleep unarmed." "And what happened next?" Hilton rose to face him, calm. He didn't shout, just said one thing, "Leave her be." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Did Slaney speak?" "Yes." He said, "You had your chance." And then he raised the gun. Hilton tried to raise his own, but the shot hit him in the shoulder. He dropped the weapon. Elsie's voice cracked slightly at the memory. Then came the second shot. Chest. Hilton collapsed. "And you!" I screamed, I think. I grabbed my pistol from the drawer beside the bed. I fired once. I don't know how I missed. She swallowed, eyes shining, but not yet crying. Then everything spun. I felt pain, cold. I think I fell. The last thing I saw was Abe, standing over Hilton, just looking at him. Then he left, quietly, no footsteps, no rush, as if it had all gone exactly how he wanted. Holmes sat back, nodding once in silence. "You saved yourself by resisting him," he said gently. "If you hadn't, he might have taken you." Elsie shook her head slowly. "He never wanted me, not really. He just wanted the power of what he lost." Watson placed a hand gently on her wrist, grounding her. "You did what you had to. You survived." Elsie met Holmes' eyes once more. "Do you think he'll come back?" Holmes's voice was firm, low. "No, he knows we're here now. And he knows he's left his fingerprints in more than blood." She nodded once and closed her eyes. Within seconds, exhaustion overtook her, and she drifted into a light, fragile sleep. Holmes rose and left the room, his mind already shifting back to the scene. Downstairs, Lestrade was speaking to his officers in the foyer. When he saw Holmes approaching, he gestured towards the library, and the two men entered without speaking. Lestrade closed the door behind them. "She told you?" "She did. It matches the physical evidence. Shot 1, shoulder, shot 2, chest, third shot, hers, into the wall." Slaney entered, fired without hesitation, and left. "You're certain he didn't steal anything?" Lestrade asked. "Nothing was taken. Not even the letter. He left. This wasn't robbery. It wasn't vengeance either. It was control. He wanted to end something on his own terms. He believed that by killing Hilton, he could break Elsie, return her to his influence." Lestrade folded his arms. "And now? Now she's beyond his reach. But he's not beyond ours." Holmes moved to the large writing desk in the corner where he had earlier placed a hand-drawn layout of the room. He studied the map carefully. every object, every scuff, every bullet path. Then he spoke slowly. Slaney entered through the hallway door. Likely picked the lock. He was trained to do so. He stepped inside and found Hilton already rising. The shot to the shoulder disarmed him immediately. Elsie reached for her weapon. She fired once, struck the wall. Slaney had already fired again by then. Hilton was dead before he hit the floor. And then? Then Slaney left the message, left the room, walked out the back door. Lestrade arched a brow. The back door was locked. Holmes nodded. He had a key. Or he unlocked it earlier that evening when the house was quiet. He's familiar with the structure. He had mapped it just as I did, only from the shadows. Lestrade exhaled through his nose. And now? Now we turn his own methods against him. Holmes walked to the center of the room, placing a hand flat against the map. He believes the code was his alone, that he used it to speak, to intimidate, to summon. But it's been turned. We have the cipher now, and I intend to write him a message. Lestrade blinked. In the dancing men? Exactly. A message he won't ignore, because it will be from Elsie. Holmes lifted his head, and for the first time that morning, there was something new in his voice. Not fear, not tension, purpose. We will write him a note in his own language, and we will tell him exactly where to go, and when. And when he arrives, we'll be waiting. The library of Riddling Thorpe Manor had become something between a war room and a sanctuary. The heavy curtains remained drawn, casting the room in a moody, contemplative half-light. The table, once used for reading and writing letters, was now cleared of books and draped with carefully organized materials, cipher sheets, rough maps, ink pots, sharpened pencils, and notes written in Holmes's unmistakably exacting hand. At the center lay a blank sheet of paper, fine quality, thick, cream-colored. Holmes had selected it with purpose. This was not just any letter. This was bait. Holmes sat at the head of the table, head bent slightly forward, eyes fixed on the cipher Elsie had helped him perfect. He did not rush. This message had to be authentic, not just in the characters it used, but in the emotional signature it carried. Slaney would recognize any false step. The spacing, the phrasing, even the rhythm of the figures, all had to feel like her. Watson stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the process unfold in silence. He understood Holmes well enough to know that this kind of construction was more than logic. It was performance, yes, but it was also an act of psychological mimicry. Holmes wasn't simply writing to a criminal. He was thinking as him. At last, Holmes began to draw, one figure at a time. The little stick men with their awkward postures, their arms raised and twisted like marionettes in mid-movement, each one placed precisely. No wasted strokes, no guesswork. Watson leaned in, watching as Holmes murmured under his breath, L-O-S, Tim. Another set followed, C-H-A-N-C-I, and finally, M-O-O-Ta. Then a location, then a time. Holmes finished the sequence, laid down the pencil, and leaned back in his chair. It's done. Lestrade entered just then, nodding toward the paper. This will get him? Holmes didn't look away from the note. It will. The message reads, Last chance. Meet me at the old well house, tonight at 10. Lestrade raised a brow. And what makes you think he'll come? Because he believes she still belongs to him. Because he needs to see her once more. And because he doesn't yet know we've broken his code. He'll read this and think it's her. A surrender, or at least a hesitation. And to a man like Slaney, hesitation is all the invitation he needs. Watson stepped closer. You think he'll come alone? He always has. His confidence is his weakness. He believes himself untraceable. He believes fear is a leash. And he doesn't believe we'll be waiting. Lestrade took the note and examined it closely. We'll have men at every approach. No. Holmes's voice was firm. We keep the site clean. Only you, Watson, and myself. He'll smell a trap if he sees uniforms. We let him come in close. Let him lower his guard. And then when he reaches the center of the well house, we close the door. Watson frowned slightly. And what if he's armed? He will be. That's why we'll be ready before he ever raises the gun. By nightfall, the plan was in motion. The well house sat on the far end of the estate, where the boundary trees formed a natural enclosure. It hadn't been used in years. Its timber beams were warped, its stone floor covered in moss and dried leaves. But the roof still held, and the door still latched. It was the perfect place for a private meeting, or an arrest. The message was left in a place Slaney was sure to check, a familiar corner of the fencing just beyond the garden hedge. Holmes had placed it himself, taking care not to leave footprints, tucking the folded paper into the wooden slats with the corner just barely visible. Not too obvious, not too subtle, just enough. And then they waited. Night returned with the same dense quiet as before. The fields beyond the manor lay still under a waxing moon, and the wind barely stirred the tops of the hedgerows. Holmes, Watson, and Lestrade made their way to the well house just after 9. They left the door ajar and stationed themselves just inside the shadows, each armed, each patient. Inside, the well pit itself had long been sealed, but the structure retained its echo. Even the sound of boots brushing old straw carried. They waited in silence. At exactly 10 o'clock, a figure appeared. Tall, slender, confident. He moved like a man responding to an invitation, not entering enemy territory. He carried something in his right hand, held low, partly concealed by the flap of his coat. His steps were careful, but not hesitant. He entered through the open door, eyes sweeping the space. "Elsie?" His voice was low, rough, uncertain. "Elsie, I got your message. I knew you'd—" Holmes stepped out of the shadows. "No, Slaney. You got mine." Slaney froze. For a half-second, no one moved. Then Slaney turned, too fast. The weapon in his hand began to rise, but not fast enough. Lestrade's revolver was already leveled. "Drop it, Slaney. Now!" Slaney hesitated, his eyes darting from Holmes to Watson to the dark corners behind them, calculating odds that no longer favored him. He dropped the revolver. It landed with a dull thud on the stone floor. Holmes stepped forward, retrieving the weapon. "You've followed her across an ocean, terrorized her for months, killed her husband in cold blood, and now you'll answer for all of it." Slaney's shoulders fell. For the first time, the confidence drained from his face. His voice came out quiet. "She never said goodbye." Holmes met his eyes with a level stare. "She didn't need to. She left you behind, and you were too arrogant to accept it." Lestrade approached with the handcuffs, snapping them into place without ceremony. "You're under arrest for the murder of Hilton Cubitt and the attempted murder of Elsie Cubitt. You'll speak next in court." And with that, the man who had spoken only in shadows and codes was silenced. The return to Ridlingthorpe Manor in the early hours of the next morning was quiet, not from exhaustion, but from the collective sense of resolution that had finally begun to settle. The arrest of Abe Slaney had been swift, efficient, and, in its own way, surgical. There had been no outburst, no last-minute struggle, no dramatics. The man had walked into the well house believing he was steps away from reclaiming what he had lost. Instead, he had walked straight into a snare crafted from his own pride and a language he never thought would betray him. Holmes, Watson, and Lestrade rode in silence back through the village lanes, the moon now giving way to the earliest gray of dawn. Fields they had passed the day before, once filled with creeping uncertainty, now looked like what they were: simple, green, quiet. The fog had lifted, the trees stood still. By the time they reached the manor, a slow rain had begun to fall, the kind that made no sound against the windows, but left streaks along the glass like gentle brushstrokes. The household was just beginning to stir. The staff, unaware of the night's events, were lighting fires and preparing the first kettle of tea. The stillness of the rooms bore no trace of what had occurred in them only days before. Holmes went directly to the library and retrieved the collection of messages, each one now sealed in separate envelopes, arranged in order of appearance, including the very last note Slaney had left behind in the bedroom after the shooting. He sat down, opened it once more, and unfolded the sheet with slow, deliberate care. There were 11 figures on the page, 11 dancing men, the most intricate of all the messages Slaney had written. Watson entered with tea in hand and placed it on the table beside him. "You've already translated it, haven't you?" Holmes nodded slightly, but said nothing at first. He stared at the page, eyes scanning not only the symbols, but the emotional current that had flowed through them. "This message was not like the others," he said finally. "The others were pressure. This was something else." He held the paper up in the lamplight and began speaking the letters aloud, one by one. E-L-S-I-E-P-R-E-P-A-R-E. Watson's eyes followed each letter as it emerged. Tucked. O, mem, E, E. Holmes stopped, hesitated, not for effect, but for something deeper. Part. Y. Jerry. O. W. He laid the paper flat again. "It's not only a threat, it's a sentence. A verdict. Slaney didn't come here to talk. Not this time. He came to pass judgment." Watson's voice was quiet. "And he left it there, on the bed." "Yes. Why not take it with him? Because he thought she'd be dead, and this would be the last thing she saw. It was never meant to be evidence. It was meant to be a final word, a message from the past, reclaiming its place over the present." Holmes traced the figures on the page with one finger, slowly, but he underestimated her, and he underestimated us. He used a code he believed was his alone, but it wasn't. She gave it to me, not because she wanted revenge, but because she was tired of being silent. Watson sat down across from him. "And now? Now he'll face trial. The cipher, the notes, Elsie's testimony, they're more than enough. The physical evidence aligns perfectly. We have the footprints, the gun, the handwriting, even the ash he left behind. And the motive, well, that was never hidden, only delayed." Holmes paused, then added, "But there's something else." Watson waited. Slaney's greatest mistake wasn't the murder. It wasn't even the messages. It was believing that fear would keep Elsie from ever speaking. That silence was something permanent, but fear and silence are not the same. And when she chose to break that silence, the entire foundation of his power collapsed. Watson looked down at the decoded message one last time. The stick figures now stripped of their mystery, no longer cryptic, no longer powerful, just shapes, symbols emptied of purpose. Holmes folded the page and placed it back into its envelope. This is no longer his language. And with that he stood and turned to the window. Outside, the rain had deepened into a soft, steady rhythm across the glass. The lawn beyond the garden was brightening slightly with morning light, and the wind stirred only gently now, no longer ominous, but clean and new. Slaney had spoken in symbols, but in the end, it had been reason, courage, and choice. that had the final word. The morning wore on with a hush that was more reverent than tense. It wasn't just the storm that had passed, or the manhunt that had come to a close. It was something deeper, the unspoken recognition that a wound had been opened in this house, and though justice was now in motion, healing would not come quickly. Holmes stood near the hearth in the drawing room, facing Inspector Lestrade, who sat scribbling notes into his journal. Beside them, a small table held all the physical evidence collected over the past days, the revolvers carefully wrapped in cloth, the messages now protected in transparent envelopes, the bullet extracted from the wall, and a small notebook recovered from Slaney's coat pocket after his arrest. Holmes tapped the notebook. This, more than anything, confirms what we already knew. It's written in his hand. Dates, places, half-coded entries, yes, but with our key, it's no longer a mystery. He kept a record of every visit to the property, every message he delivered, every time he saw her face. Lestrade raised an eyebrow as he flipped through the book's pages, noting the precise observations. He was watching her even before the first note appeared. Holmes nodded. He studied her patterns, knew when Hilton left the estate, learned the maid's routine, even described the timing of the bedroom lights. And each note, he logged when it was placed and what time he believed she discovered it. Watson stood nearby, listening. He had just returned from checking on Elsie, who remained upstairs resting, her recovery steady but slow. Holmes continued. Slaney believed he had a right to her, that by staying silent, she had consented to his pursuit, and when she broke that silence by turning to me, he saw it as betrayal, not defiance, betrayal. Lestrade closed the notebook with a soft snap. Obsession always ends in the same place. He turned toward the evidence tray. And the revolver? Holmes stepped over, lifted the heavier of the two pistols, Hilton's, and held it for a moment before setting it down again. Hilton never fired. The safety was still engaged. He never even had time to lift it. The bullet that struck him in the chest came from Slaney's weapon, a .32 caliber recovered at the well house. Lestrade pointed to the smaller revolver. And hers? Fired once. The bullet lodged in the far wall matches the caliber. She missed, likely fired in panic after Hilton went down. Watson added softly, and yet she survived. Because he didn't come to kill her immediately. He came to bend her will, to frighten her into submission. But when Hilton stood between them, the dynamic changed. Slaney saw him not as a barrier, but as a rival. That's why he shot to kill. Lestrade jotted notes again, murmuring as he wrote. A classic case of possession disguised as love. He looked up. And now? Holmes walked slowly toward the window, arms crossed. Now the law takes its turn. The evidence is overwhelming. Witness testimony, recovered items, physical traces, but the deeper proof lies in motive and pattern. Slaney didn't act out of madness. He acted out of method, every step calculated, every note a piece of theater. Lestrade leaned back. But he underestimated you. Holmes shook his head. He underestimated her. That's where he truly failed. A quiet beat passed between them. Then Lestrade asked the question that had, until now, gone unspoken. And how do you believe the jury will see it? Holmes replied without hesitation. He crossed an ocean to claim a woman who had fled from him in fear. He threatened her life with coded violence. He murdered her husband in cold blood, then left her for dead. Whatever they choose to call it, murder, attempted murder, coercion, it will be enough. Holmes turned from the window and spoke more quietly now. But the real tragedy is this. Hilton Cubitt died not for a mystery or a scandal or a hidden crime, but for love. He made one request before their marriage, that she never be forced to speak of her past. And in the end, that silence cost him his life. Watson looked toward the hallway where the morning sun was beginning to creep across the floorboards. He protected her, even when he didn't understand what he was protecting her from. Holmes gave a quiet nod, and she protected him until she couldn't. Lestrade gathered his materials, placing the evidence into labeled packets. "We'll take him to London tonight and let the Crown handle the rest." He paused at the door. "You did well, Holmes." Holmes didn't answer immediately. He simply looked back toward the sealed envelope on the desk, the final message written in dancing figures. Then he said, "This wasn't about solving a case. It was about understanding the cost of silence." And then he returned to the evidence, preparing for the final interviews that would soon follow. The day following Slaney's arrest passed in an almost unnatural quiet. The emotional weight of what had transpired hung low over Riddling Thorpe Manor, like mist that refused to lift even as the sunlight pressed gently against the windows. The household moved slowly. Doors opened and closed with a kind of reverence. No one spoke above a whisper. It was not grief alone that silenced the rooms. It was reflection, the kind of stillness that follows the realization that something terrible had passed just inches from being worse. Upstairs, Elsie Cubitt slept deeply, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion of days spent holding her fear tightly wound inside her. Watson remained near, checking on her often, ensuring her breathing remained steady and her pulse strong. She had not yet asked about the trial or about Slaney's fate. That conversation would come later, when the mind could bear the weight of it. Downstairs, in the drawing room where the case had first taken root, Holmes and Lestrade sat across from one another, reviewing the final preparations for what would become the centerpiece of the prosecution, the baited message, the trap that had led to Slaney's capture. Lestrade, ever meticulous, had brought a clean copy of the coded note Holmes had constructed. The fake message, written in the same dancing men code, designed to appear as if Elsie herself had written it. "Last chance. Meet me at the old well house, tonight at 10. Holmes studied it one last time. "It worked," he said simply. Lestrade nodded. He believed it, because we gave him exactly what he wanted. Ambiguity, not a confession, not a surrender, but doubt. A question only he believed he could answer. Watson entered the room, fresh from checking on Elsie. She's still asleep. Colors returned to her cheeks. "I think the worst has passed." Holmes gave a brief nod. "We should discuss the trap while it's fresh." Lestrade leaned forward. "It was a calculated risk, Holmes. If Slaney had smelled a trap, he wouldn't have come." Holmes finished the thought for him, but he didn't, because the note was true to her pattern. The figures used were drawn with her particular spacing, the language matched her past phrasing, and more importantly, the note mirrored what Slaney wanted to hear. Hesitation, not surrender, but emotional conflict. He couldn't resist the chance to test her one last time. Lestrade smiled slightly. "You even mimicked her uneven spacing. Every detail mattered." Slaney had been decoding those messages for weeks. He was attuned to every nuance. If the arms of one figure bent too sharply, if the sequence order broke his expectations, he'd have walked away. Watson took the message, examining it closely. "So you lured him in with the illusion of uncertainty?" "Exactly. A man like Slaney thrives on perceived weakness. It validates his power. He believes he is irresistible, that no matter what she suffered, she will still come to him. And if she doesn't, he believes he can force the outcome." Lestrade reached into his coat and produced a list of charges that had already begun to accumulate at Scotland Yard. He's wanted in Chicago, you know. 4 names, 1 disappearance, and now a British murder to crown it all. Holmes looked away for a moment. It doesn't matter where the list started. What matters is where it ends, and that Lestrade is here. Watson walked to the window, watching the last of the London constables escort Slaney to the carriage outside. The man did not look back. No defiance, no arrogance, just resignation. The bravado had drained from him once the cuffs were locked. Perhaps he had known then that the game, however long he had played it, was finally done. Lestrade tucked the message back into his folder. "I'll send the decoding chart to the Crown solicitor. They'll want the jury to see how the messages work, step by step. And they'll need a statement from Elsie when she's ready." "She will be," Holmes said quietly. "And Hilton? His funeral will be held in 2 days. Quiet. You're just family and a few from the village. Elsie asked that there be no press, no questions. I've arranged for the protection of her privacy." Lestrade stood, gathering his coat. "Well, I'll be heading back to London. If you've no objection, I'll list you in the official report as a consultant on record." Holmes glanced up. "That won't be necessary. The man is caught. Let the rest fade." Lestrade looked as if he might protest, but didn't. He extended his hand. "It was clean work, Holmes. Painful, but clean. Justice, as it should be." Holmes shook his hand, and Lestrade left without another word. Watson returned to the armchair opposite Holmes and sat in silence for a moment. "Do you ever think what might have happened had we not acted in time?" Holmes turned toward the fire, watching the flames bend and shift over the logs. "Yes, I think about it often. But we did act in time. Because sometimes, Watson, justice doesn't come in the form of law. It comes in the form of interruption." Watson raised an eyebrow. "Interruption?" He nodded slowly. "We interrupted a man who believed himself inevitable, and that, more than anything, saved her. And in the flicker of firelight and silence, the trap they had set, rooted not in violence, but in language, stood as one of Holmes's most elegant victories. The air had turned heavier by the time evening came to Ridlingthorpe Manor. The light was fading in the fields, but the sun hadn't quite set. It was that brief, quiet window when shadows lengthened and colors turned to muted grays. For most, it was the soft descent into a peaceful night. For Holmes, it was the hour when things happened. It was just past 10 o'clock when the constable stationed near the well house signaled with a single, low whistle, prearranged and unmistakable. Holmes and Watson had been waiting, concealed in the nearby tree line, perfectly still, blending with the darkened outlines of brush and timber. Lestrade, hidden behind the collapsed wall of the old orchard boundary, caught the signal as well and began moving silently toward the rear of the structure. Holmes raised one hand, still, waiting. Then the figure appeared. Abe Slaney. He stepped out of the trees with the confidence of a man who believed he had just crossed the final line into victory. Dressed in a dark wool coat, collar high, hat tilted low, he walked toward the well house with a slow, measured stride. No rush, no caution. His hands were visible. He looked neither left nor right. He approached as if summoned. The door to the well house was slightly ajar, just as it had been left, an invitation by design. Slaney didn't hesitate. He stepped inside. Holmes gave the signal. They moved quickly. Watson approached the door from one side, revolver in hand, but lowered. Lestrade came around from the rear entrance, footsteps muffled by the mossy ground. Holmes himself entered directly through the main door, blocking the exit. Inside, Slaney had just realized something was off. His expression shifted from anticipation to confusion. He turned to the door and froze. Holmes stood in front of him, arms at his sides, eyes steady. "She's not coming, Slaney?" The American blinked. "You?" "Yes." Slaney's eyes moved behind Holmes to the other figures now entering the well house. "Watson?" "Lestrade. And your little trap worked, didn't it?" "It did." Slaney raised his hand slowly. He wasn't armed. At least, not openly. Holmes had suspected as much. Slaney had come believing he was meeting Elsie. His weapon would have been tucked away, perhaps at the small of his back, hidden beneath the coat. A last resort, not the first move. He tried to smile, but it was the weary, bitter smile of a man caught in the final act of his own performance. "She wrote that note?" "No." "You?" "Yes." Slaney let out a low breath, almost a laugh. "And I believed it. Because you wanted to." Holmes stepped forward. "You didn't come here for love. You came for possession. To restore a version of the past that never really existed. She left you behind in America, and that truth, more than any threat, was what you couldn't bear." Slaney's voice grew quieter. "She was mine. Once. She was never yours." Holmes's voice was low but sharp. "You followed her across an ocean. Sent her messages meant to control, not to persuade. And when that failed, you killed the one man who dared stand between you and your illusion." Slaney's face hardened. "He pulled a gun on me," he defended his wife. There was a moment of silence. Then Lestrade stepped forward and pulled the revolver from inside Slaney's coat. The man offered no resistance. The weapon was loaded, safety off. Watson asked quietly, "Did you really think you could leave here with her?" Slaney didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Holmes, eyes searching for some thread of understanding. "I didn't come to kill her. You came knowing you might. That's enough." Holmes stepped aside as Lestrade produced the handcuffs. "Abe Slaney, you are under arrest for the murder of Hilton Cubitt and the attempted murder of Elsie Cubitt. You will be remanded to London for trial." Slaney didn't argue. As the cuffs clicked shut, he said only one thing, more to himself than to the men around him. "She should have answered." "Just once," Holmes replied without cruelty. "She answered when she left." With that, Slaney was led from the well house into the night. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly. The trees whispered against one another, and somewhere beyond the estate, a dog barked once, then fell silent. The moon was rising higher now, pale and detached above the countryside. Holmes watched Slaney disappear into the distance, flanked by Lestrade and the constables, and then he turned, his coat catching slightly in the breeze, and made his way back toward the manor, toward the life that had chosen courage over fear, toward a woman who had once been silenced and had, finally, when it mattered most, been heard. The journey from Ridlingthorpe Manor to the Norwich holding station was carried out under strict silence. Abe Slaney sat between two constables in the enclosed carriage, wrists shackled, face unreadable. The dim lantern swinging above cast flickering shadows across his features, deepening the creases in his forehead, sharpening the fatigue in his eyes. He had not asked where they were taking him. He already knew. Holmes had said nothing after the arrest, and Slaney had not tried to explain himself. But the quiet wasn't remorse. It was something colder. A man watching the walls of a long-constructed fantasy finally collapse around him. Holmes and Watson followed in a separate carriage, trailing behind as the rain started again, soft and steady against the windows. Holmes remained still, his arms folded, his gaze locked on some distant point just beyond the passing hedgerows. Watson, at last, broke the silence. "Do you think he understands now what he's done?" Holmes didn't turn. "No, I think he understands only that he lost." It was nearing dawn when they arrived at the station. Lestrade had ridden ahead to arrange processing. When the carriages arrived, he was already waiting at the gate with the papers in hand. Slaney was escorted from the vehicle. Even in chains, he walked with deliberate steps. There was no struggle, but there was also no acceptance. He turned once to glance behind him, toward the direction of Riddling Thorpe, but Holmes met his gaze and gave a slight shake of the head. There was nothing left to return to. Inside the station, Slaney was formally charged. Lestrade read out the accusations one by one: murder, attempted murder, criminal trespassing, unlawful possession of firearms, and obstruction of justice. With each count, Slaney's expression grew more fixed. He said nothing in reply. When asked if he had anything to declare, he simply gave a curt shrug and said, "She was supposed to come with me." The room was silent. Holmes stepped forward, voice calm. "She chose something stronger than fear. You were never chasing her, Slaney. You were chasing the version of her that belonged to you. But that version never existed. You invented her in your mind, and when she refused to play the role, you decided she had betrayed you." Slaney looked up then, and for a brief second, there was something behind his eyes, something fragile, a flicker of recognition that maybe, just maybe, he had misunderstood her all along. And yet, that moment passed. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "He'll give a statement, not now, but soon. Men like him always do, once they think the last thread of sympathy is still within reach." Watson leaned in slightly. "Do you think he regrets it?" Holmes considered the question, then replied without sentiment. "He regrets failing, not killing, not scarring, not terrifying her, just failing to win." Lestrade gave the signal, and Slaney was led down the corridor to the holding cells. The door closed behind him with a dull, final clank, metal on stone, the last punctuation in a story that had started not with a gunshot, but with a series of childish-looking figures drawn in chalk. Back outside, the sky had begun to pale again. The clouds broke in places, revealing soft stripes of blue. The storm had passed completely now, and the air smelled different, cleaner, lighter. As they mounted the steps to return to the waiting carriage, Lestrade paused. "He said she was supposed to come with him," Holmes answered without turning. "Obsession always believes itself to be destiny." Watson exhaled slowly, the weight of the past few days finally beginning to settle. "And what now?" "Now," Holmes said, "we tell her." 3 days had passed since the arrest. In the stone-walled interrogation room of the Norwich holding facility, Abe Slaney sat alone at the end of a narrow table. The room was windowless and sparsely furnished, just 2 chairs, the table, and a flickering gaslight that cast a dull yellow glow against the gray walls. There was no clock, no sense of time, only silence and stillness. Lestrade entered first, followed by Holmes. Neither of them carried paper. Neither brought a weapon. It was not a confrontation. It was a reckoning. Slaney did not stand. He barely looked up. "You came," he muttered. "You asked for us," Lestrade replied, remaining by the door. Holmes took the seat across from Slaney and said nothing. Slaney stared at his fingers, cuffed loosely, resting on the table. "I thought maybe, if I said it, someone would understand." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "Understanding is not the same as forgiveness." Slaney gave a faint scoff. There was no real bitterness in it, just fatigue. "She was never supposed to marry him. That wasn't part of it. I thought she left to protect me. I thought she'd come back. That once things cooled off in Chicago, once I had the money, the means, she'd be waiting." Holmes spoke softly, precisely. "She left because of you." Slaney looked at him sharply. "She left because she thought I'd be killed. The people I worked for back there, they weren't gentle. She thought if she stayed, she'd drag me into the light and I'd get myself killed. So she ran. Not from fear, from love. He let the words hang for a moment, but you followed. Slaney's voice lowered. At first, I just wanted to see her, to know she was safe, that she hadn't forgotten me. And when you saw her with Hilton Cubitt, I thought she was hiding. You saw a quiet life, a husband, a manor house. You saw peace. I saw her pretending I hadn't existed. Holmes studied him. You sent messages, coded, threatening. And when she didn't answer, Slaney closed his eyes briefly. It twisted something. I started thinking, if I could just see her, speak to her, if she heard my voice again, looked in my eyes, maybe she'd remember. And the threats? Slaney didn't answer. The messages changed. You stopped asking her to come back. You started warning her, commanding her. And in the end, you came in person. Slaney rubbed his face, slow and heavy. He was standing in front of her, defending her. I didn't mean to. Holmes's voice remained calm. You raised the gun. Twice. I didn't mean to kill him, but you did. He fell, just dropped, right there. Then she fired at me. I panicked. I don't even remember pulling the trigger. I thought it hit her heart. I thought she was gone. So you left a message. Slaney looked up then. His voice cracked. I wrote it before I even knew she was still breathing. Holmes leaned forward. You left a note telling her to prepare to meet her God. You aimed to be the last voice she heard, and you believed in those final moments that she'd belong to you again, not alive, but by force, by fear. Slaney said nothing. Lestrade stepped forward now, voice low but firm. Your confession matches the evidence, the messages, the revolvers, her testimony. You'll be taken to London tomorrow. There will be a trial, and you'll be sentenced. Slaney sat still for a long time. Finally, he looked at Holmes. She's alive? She is. And she knows. She knows everything. Slaney's mouth moved slightly. Not a smile, not a frown, just a breath. Tell her I wasn't trying to be a monster. Holmes stood. You became one anyway. As the two men left the room, the gaslight flickered once more, casting Slaney's figure into brief shadow, then back into view. He sat alone, no longer speaking, no longer reaching, only waiting. It was late afternoon when Holmes returned to Ridlingthorpe Manor. The rain had finally lifted for good, and the grounds breathed quietly beneath a soft sun. A few of the villagers had left flower arrangements at the front gate in memory of Hilton Cubitt. No one rang the bell. No one came asking for comment. The house had become, once again, a sanctuary. Elsie was seated in the garden when Holmes arrived. She was wrapped in a shawl despite the warmth, her posture upright but fragile. Watson was with her, speaking softly. She looked smaller than before, quieter, but there was clarity in her eyes now. The deep, trembling fear that once clung to her expression had been replaced by something steadier. Grief, yes, but also release. She stood slowly as Holmes approached, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then she asked without preamble, "Did he confess?" He did. Watson remained by her side, silent, steady. Holmes sat beside her on the stone bench. He said he didn't mean to kill Hilton, that it happened in panic, that he thought he'd lost control. And when you stood up to him, when you raised your weapon, it broke something in him. Elsie didn't flinch. He came here to destroy the life I built, and when he couldn't have me, he took from me what he thought I'd give up to get him back. Holmes nodded. You were never silent, Elsie. You were strong, and when you had to speak, you did. She turned toward him, but it cost everything. He looked at her for a long moment. It cost what could never be kept in fear. Hilton died with the truth in his heart, that you loved him, that you never hid behind him, that you stood beside him, that matters more than anything Slaney tried to take. She took a deep breath. And the shooting? Holmes recounted it gently, not like testimony, but like stitching a memory back together. Slaney entered the room with a plan. He waited in the corner, watching. Hilton stood, spoke. Slaney fired once, shoulder, enough to disarm. The second shot, chest, was immediate. Hilton fell. You reached for your weapon, fired, you missed. Slaney hesitated. You were wounded either by accident or in panic. He believed you were dead. He left the message by the bed and disappeared. But he was wrong. You lived, and your voice returned. Elsie didn't cry. She sat still, eyes locked on the horizon where the trees bent gently in the wind. He wasn't always like that, she said finally. When we were young, he was just wild, not cruel, just lost. And when did that change? When he learned that fear got him what charm no longer could. Watson looked down, voice low. And you were the first thing he ever tried to keep through fear. She nodded, but not the last. There were others in Chicago. I knew what he was becoming. That's why I left. That's why I never looked back. She paused, until the letters came, until he crossed the ocean, until Hilton was gone. Holmes didn't interrupt. He let the moment hold. Elsie turned toward him once more. I know justice will be served, but that doesn't bring back what was taken. No, Holmes agreed quietly. It doesn't, but it protects what remains. She nodded slowly. Then I will carry what remains with both hands. Holmes stood. The garden rustled softly as the breeze moved through it. When the trial comes, he said, you'll be called upon to speak, to tell the truth as only you can. I will, she said, and I won't speak for him, only for Hilton. And that, Holmes knew, was exactly what justice demanded. Not vengeance, not anger, just truth, carried plainly, carried bravely. In the weeks that followed the arrest and confession of Abe Slaney, Ridlingthorpe Manor settled into something closer to stillness. Not quite peace, not yet healing, but the quiet pause that allows both to begin. The fields of Norfolk turned green again as the early summer advanced, and the birdsong that once seemed ominous returned as part of the natural rhythm. The house, though shadowed by loss, stood firm. Elsie Cubitt remained at the manor. Though her wound had closed and the bruising faded from her side, her recovery moved slowly, not because of the physical pain, but because the silence of the rooms where Hilton once lived could not be dressed or stitched. Watson stayed for several days after the inquest, checking her health, observing her behavior. He noted, quietly in his journal, that she never once spoke Hilton's name aloud, but neither did she avoid it when others did. She listened, she nodded, she remembered. But she carried his absence in a way that was deliberate and inward, like a secret she would protect from erosion. Holmes visited often, but never unannounced and never with questions. His presence in those days was not that of a detective, but of a quiet observer, someone who understood that the solving of a case did not bring closure, only clarity. He often stood in the garden in the early evening, watching Elsie from a distance as she read beneath the trees or walked the path between the rose hedges where she and Hilton once strolled. He never spoke unless spoken to, and when he did, it was with gentle simplicity. On the 10th morning after Slaney's transfer to London, Elsie finally requested to speak alone with Holmes. They met in the small reading room near the back of the house, where sunlight streamed in across the floorboards and the air smelled faintly of old paper and lavender oil. She sat on a cushioned chair by the window, a blanket over her knees. Her voice was quiet but sure. The days are longer now. I used to love that about Norfolk, but lately the light feels too revealing. Holmes listened. I still wake up thinking I hear his boots on the stairs, that he's gone to check the gates again, that I'll find him reading the morning paper with the kettle just beginning to whistle. Holmes said nothing, but then I remembered that he died thinking I had kept something from him, that I brought danger into his life. Holmes stepped forward slowly. He knew. In his own way, he always knew. She turned to him, but he never asked, because he trusted you. Elsie exhaled. That's what makes it harder. He gave me peace, and I brought him a man with a gun and a code drawn in chalk. Holmes knelt beside her chair. You didn't bring Slaney here. You ran from him. You started a new life. He followed. He chose the path. And Hilton chose to protect you with the life he had. He died not from your secrets, but for your safety. There is a difference. She nodded slowly. They say Slaney will be tried by September. Holmes confirmed. He'll face full charges, and his written confession makes the prosecution stronger than any code we ever broke. Elsie was quiet for a long time. Then, do you think I'll ever sleep without waking from it? Yes, but not because you forget, because you'll begin to remember differently. She looked at him. Remember what? That you survived, that you told the truth, and that you are free. She blinked slowly. And if he's acquitted, he won't be. And if he escapes, he won't. Holmes stood. And if the day comes when memory still claws at your door, open it, walk through it, face what's there, and keep walking. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in days, but her voice wavered slightly. You don't just solve crimes, Mr. Holmes. You carry them. He met her gaze. Only until those who live them can walk forward on their own. As he turned to leave, she called out softly, Do you believe I'll find peace here again? He looked back. Yes, not today, but soon. Peace always comes to those who seek it, without shame. She lowered her head, and for the first time in many days, she smiled, faintly but clearly. It was late summer in London when Holmes returned to Baker Street, the city thick with its familiar haze of coal smoke and carriage wheels, street vendors shouting above the clatter, and the Thames shimmering behind the soot of industry. The contrast between the quiet grace of riddling Thorpe and the rhythm of the capital was stark, but Holmes slipped back into his element, as though he had never left. Still, something about this case remained with him. Not like the puzzles he sometimes kept on his desk or the artifacts he collected from unusual clients, this one had weight, the kind that pressed deeper the longer one carried it. Watson noticed it almost immediately. Holmes did not pace in his usual manner, nor did he launch into experiments or fresh cases. Instead, he spent several long afternoons sitting in his armchair by the window, pipe unlit, hands folded, eyes on the street below. On one of those afternoons, as the rain passed and a muted sun began to warm the bay windows of 221B, Watson finally asked, You've solved murders before, Holmes. Why does this one stay with you? Holmes didn't answer immediately. Then, quietly, without his usual sharpness, he said, Because it was built on silence. Watson leaned forward. Elsie's? No. Everyone's. Hers, yes, but Hilton's too. The servants, even Slaney, each of them hiding behind words not said, truths not shared. This case wasn't won by tracking footprints or studying ash. It was solved because someone finally decided to speak. Watson nodded slowly. And because you learned their language. Holmes gave the faintest smile. The dancing men. Curious, isn't it? How a handful of crooked stick figures, drawn with chalk on an old garden door, could carry so much weight. Watson rose and moved to the mantel, where a small envelope now rested beside Holmes' violin. It contained one of the original drawings, The first message Hilton had brought with him from Norfolk. The figures danced in a jagged line, their arms crooked, some raised, some lowered. Out of context, it looked almost childish, innocent, but Watson understood now how deeply dangerous it had been. He lifted the envelope gently. "You've decoded 100 ciphers, Holmes. Broken royal seals, intercepted forged documents, exposed military lies. And yet this little row of stickmen may have saved more than a life. It saved a future." Holmes rose, walking to the fireplace. "It reminded me of something, Watson, that beneath every case file, beneath every bloodstain or confession or courtroom transcript, lies the most stubborn variable of all, emotion." He turned, meeting Watson's gaze. "You can't measure fear. You can't graph silence. You can't quantify longing or regret, or the damage of a threat whispered in a familiar tongue. And yet they shape the outcome more than any deduction ever could." Watson raised a brow. "Are you suggesting you were led by emotion?" "No, I was led by logic. But I listened to emotion, and that's what changed the game." He stepped over to his desk and opened a new folder. Inside, he began placing a full copy of the decoded messages, the cipher key, and a brief handwritten summary. "A case closed," Watson said. "No," Holmes corrected gently. "A case completed." Watson smiled faintly, then added, "And a woman finally free." Holmes nodded once. Yes. He returned to his chair and lit his pipe, not out of habit but with ceremony, as if to mark the true end of something profound. Outside, the city moved on. Cabs clattered, boys sold newspapers, and the bells of St. Mary-le-Bow chimed across the rooftops. The world had barely noticed that a man had crossed an ocean to destroy a life, or that another had died protecting it. But in the quiet of Baker Street, Holmes remembered, and that was enough. It was the first clear morning in weeks when Inspector Lestrade stepped into 220B Baker Street. The air in London was dry, unusually crisp for late August, and the city seemed briefly at ease with itself. No thick fog rolling in from the docks, no cries from the newsboys of scandal or unrest, just the steady rhythm of a city exhaling. Holmes was in his usual chair, long legs stretched toward the hearth, though the fire had not been lit in days. The morning sun slanted through the windows, catching dust in the still air. Beside him, a small tray of correspondence lay untouched. Watson answered the door, greeted Lestrade with a nod, and gestured toward the sitting room. The inspector entered without ceremony, his dark coat still dusted from the road. "You've heard?" Lestrade asked, as he removed his gloves. Holmes looked up. "I assume you're referring to Slaney's full confession being entered into court record." Lestrade allowed himself a brief, satisfied smile. It was read aloud this morning, word for word. There wasn't a sound in the courtroom, not even from the press gallery. And Elsie? She provided her written statement yesterday. It was short, measured, honest. Exactly what the Crown needed. There'll be no further appearances from her unless the defense insists, which, given Slaney's admission, seems unlikely. Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. And the Crown's counsel? Quite impressed. They've built the entire case around your interpretation of the cipher and the sequence of threats. Every note you translated, every timeline you provided, they're calling it one of the clearest forensic presentations they've had in years. Watson, from his place by the window, raised an eyebrow. "Is that why you're here, Lestrade? To deliver compliments?" Lestrade grinned slightly and reached into his coat. "No, I'm here to return these." He placed a thick envelope on the side table. Inside were the original dancing men drawings, now entered into the court's exhibits, copied and catalogued. These were the genuine articles, their chalk lines now permanent records of obsession and fear. Holmes took the envelope and weighed it in his hands before setting it down, without looking. "They belong with the others," he said, "in the archive." Lestrade shifted slightly, then grew more serious. "I'll say this plainly, Holmes. If you hadn't taken the case, if Cubitt had come to Scotland Yard first, we would have written it off as domestic tragedy, a crime of passion, a closed circle, especially with the cipher looking like nonsense. No clear suspect, no motive at first glance." Holmes said nothing. Lestrade continued. "You saw past what we would have missed. You listened where others might have dismissed. You didn't just decode a cipher, you interpreted a relationship, a pattern of dominance and fear that left no fingerprints, but that shaped every move the killer made." Watson nodded. "It wasn't about the letters. It was about understanding why they mattered." Lestrade sighed, as if allowing the truth to settle over him like a coat he had resisted putting on. "You saved her, Holmes, not just from Slaney, from the life he wanted to drag her back into. And you gave Cubitt the dignity of being understood, not as a victim of scandal, but as a man who died protecting someone he loved." Holmes finally looked up. "Gratitude is not necessary, Lestrade, but it is deserved." There was a rare silence between them, one not filled with tension or rivalry, but something akin to mutual respect. Then Lestrade, after a moment, said with quiet certainty, "The Yard owes you one." Holmes smiled faintly. "Add it to the list." With that, Lestrade retrieved his hat, nodded once to Watson, and left as swiftly as he had arrived. Watson closed the door behind him and returned to his chair. "He's right, you know." Holmes didn't look up. "Perhaps, but the victory here isn't mine." "Then whose?" "Elsie's." He exhaled, eyes drifting to the envelope of dancing men, because when the message stopped being hers, she took it back. And in that quiet room above Baker Street, the only sound was the tick of the clock and the steady hum of a world that, for once, had turned toward justice. In the days following Lestrade's visit, the flat at Baker Street settled into a comforting rhythm once more. The fire returned to its hearth, the books returned to their shelves, and Holmes, to no one's surprise, immersed himself again in monographs on obscure cryptographic dialects and chemical analysis. Yet, despite all appearances of routine, I, John H. Watson, could not quite place the feeling that lingered in our shared rooms, a quiet, weighted stillness that followed Holmes like a shadow, even as he resumed his habits with precision. It was not grief. Holmes rarely carried grief, nor was it fatigue, though he had earned the right to such exhaustion after the ordeal in Norfolk. No, what remained with him was something subtler, more private. He had solved a case that demanded more than deduction. It had asked for empathy. And though he would never say it aloud, I believed it had cost him more than he let on. One evening, after supper, I finally gave voice to what I had long been thinking. He was in his chair, tuning his violin, not to play, merely to inspect its voice. I was seated opposite, reading from the Times, but my eyes had long since drifted from the page. "You know, Holmes, I don't think I've ever seen you work quite like that before." He looked up, curious but unbothered. "Like what?" "Like a man who didn't simply want to solve a crime, but to save a life." He paused in his tuning. "That's sentiment, Watson. You know I leave such things to you?" "No, that's you being modest." He studied me, as if gauging how serious I was. Then he leaned back, folding his hands over his lap, the violin resting quietly beside him. "Go on, then." And so I did. "I've seen you break open locked room mysteries, track footprints through fog, identify poisons by scent, and determine the identity of a killer, by the way they tie a knot. But I've never seen you listen the way you did to Elsie Cubitt. Never seen you move with such restraint. You could have confronted Slaney sooner, forced the matter, but you didn't. You waited. You watched. And when you wrote that final message, you didn't just outwit a criminal. You gave Elsie a voice he could no longer ignore. Holmes didn't speak for a moment. Then, "She gave me the key, Watson. I only used it." You did more than use it. You honored it. You treated her silence not as weakness, but as a kind of language. And when the time came to speak, you helped her find the words. He glanced toward the fire. "You sound as if you're giving a speech. Perhaps I am." I leaned forward. "Because it matters. We see so many crimes, so many broken things, and often your brilliance pulls the truth from the shadows. But rarely does it restore anything. This time, you restored something." Holmes looked away, and when he spoke, it was softer than I expected. There's a quiet kind of terror in watching someone be hunted by a past they can't control. Slaney didn't follow her to reclaim a lost love. He followed her to reclaim control. That's why this case was never about logic alone. It was about resistance. I smiled. "And you were part of that resistance." He looked at me now, direct and clear-eyed. "You think highly of me, Watson. I always have." He shook his head lightly, as if brushing the compliment aside, but he did not deny it. There was a long pause then, not awkward, but full, complete. Finally, Holmes returned to the violin. He drew the bow across the strings just once, letting a single note hang in the air. It was low, imperfect, but rich. "She survived," he said. "She did, and justice was served. Yes, then we did what we came to do." And with that, he raised the bow again and played, not loudly, not masterfully, but gently, a quiet tune, thoughtful and wandering, carrying through the window into the cool evening outside. And I, sitting there with the scent of pipe smoke in the air and the flicker of firelight against the walls, felt an old, deep admiration for the man I had followed across years and miles. He would never call himself a hero, but in that case, and in that moment, he was something better, human. The case of the dancing men faded from the public's eye faster than anyone might have expected. London, ever indifferent to the private grief of distant country estates, moved briskly on to newer scandals, fresher mysteries, and the endless turning of its own noisy machinery. But in the quiet corners of Ridlingthorpe Manor, and in the quieter memories of those who had lived through its darkest days, the echoes remained. Holmes, for his part, never referenced the case in the flamboyant way he did others. There was no monograph published, no lecture delivered at the Royal Society, no article penned under some anonymous credit in the criminal journals he so often frequented. And yet it stayed with him. He filed the case, labeled neatly in his cabinet as "Dancing Men, Norfolk Cipher." But he placed a small marking on the spine, a single pencil line, uncharacteristic and seemingly meaningless, but I understood. It was not a symbol of difficulty or of intellectual triumph. It was a mark of reverence. Not all victories are meant to be paraded. Elsie Cubitt eventually left Ridlingthorpe, not in haste and not to flee. She remained long enough to oversee Hilton's affairs, to close accounts, to walk once more through each room of the manor without flinching. Her recovery had been slow, but steady. Each letter she sent to Holmes in the following months was thoughtful and brief. Updates of her travels, inquiries after Watson's health, and only once a single sentence written plainly. "Thank you for believing that a code is not always just a cipher, but sometimes a cry." She had moved to the south coast, to a village near Brighton, where she could live quietly among the sea breezes and rose gardens. And from what little we heard afterward, She never remarried. But she did live intentionally and freely. That in itself was justice served. As for Abe Slaney, he stood trial at the Old Bailey. His confession, the evidence Holmes and Lestrade presented, and Elsie's written testimony made the proceedings swift and final. He was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. There was no appeal, no outburst, just the sound of the gavel falling and the long silence that followed as he was led away. But the most curious legacy was the code itself. The dancing men, those little chalk figures that had once inspired dread, became a case study in universities and security lectures across Europe. Not for their artistic value, of course, nor their complexity, which Holmes had privately admitted was elementary once a few patterns emerged, but for what they represented, a cipher born of obsession, a language used not to conceal knowledge, but to manipulate emotion, a reminder that some of the most dangerous messages ever written are not those that hide the truth, but those that twist it. I once asked Holmes late one evening as we walked along the embankment what he thought the lesson of that case had been. He paused, unusual for him, and watched the river move. The lesson, Watson, is this: men speak in words, but they command through silence. Elsie's fear was written in the spaces between the figures. Slaney's control was enforced in what he left unsaid. And Hilton Cubitt? He died trying to protect what he never fully understood but deeply respected. That is not weakness. That is nobility. And what of you? I had asked. What did you take from it? He answered, without looking away from the water. That no matter how clever the code, there is no greater strength than when a person decides to speak, especially when they've been silent for far too long. In the end, it wasn't Holmes's brilliance or the revolvers or even the confession that ended the tragedy at Riddling Thorpe. It was one woman, once voiceless, who chose not to run again, who faced her past, and in doing so, rewrote her future. The dancing men may have been drawn with childish lines and crooked arms, but in the end, they told a story as real and human as any we'd ever encountered. And now, when I think back on that strange summer, I no longer see the cipher alone. I see the people behind it, the love that was protected, the danger that was faced, and the silence that was finally broken. Not with a scream, not with a gunshot, but with the quiet dignity of truth. Holmes returned to his chair. The violin resting nearby remained untouched for days. But in the stillness of the flat, long after the gas lights had been turned low and the streets of London drifted to sleep, I heard him whisper once, not to me, but to the night itself. Even the smallest figures can cast long shadows. And so ended the adventure of the dancing men. And now, the story has come to an end. You've traveled through quiet manners, decoded hidden messages, and stood beside those who chose truth over fear. In the hands of Sherlock Holmes, the smallest clues became powerful revelations, and silence became a voice. As the mystery of the dancing men fades, let your thoughts drift softly. Let the calm of resolution settle over you like a warm blanket at the end of a long day. You are safe now. The case is closed. Justice has found its way, and peace, at last, has returned to Riddling Thorpe Manor. Thank you for joining this gentle journey into mystery. Sleep well.